Chapter 326. Renbaqian's reaction made the Empress very happy. She looked up at him with sparkling eyes and asked, "Do you really want to go with me?" "Of course." Renbaqian immediately said, "Even if it's just playing background music, it's still good to watch your Majesty's heroic posture from behind." If things went badly for him, he could still escape with the Empress. However, he definitely couldn't say this out loud. The Empress smiled with a warm look on her face. This was the happiest sentence she had heard all day. However, he still refused. Salt is also an important matter. It doesn't matter if you're in the army or not. However, you're the only one who can handle the salt. Actually, I can do a lot of things in the military. Renbaqian laughed. The Empress shook her head slightly and said, "Salt is an important matter. It's enough for the winged cavalry to follow me. Moreover, there are also 15,000 fierce soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center." Seeing that the Empress had made up her mind, Renbaqian didn't say anything else and asked, "Your Majesty, when are you going to depart?" "The detailed battle report should be sent back in 3 days. The mobilization of the armies of the Protectorate of the Center will also take a few days. We will set out in 4 days. "In that case, I will also set off in 4 days, Renbaqian said after thinking for a while. That night he returned to Earth and sat on the sofa in a daze for a while. He didn't expect things to change so quickly. He didn't know how long this war would last or how it would turn out in the end. He was hesitant about whether he should ask for poison gas from the government. Putting aside the issue of whether the nation would provide the sarin gas, as long as 600 kilograms of sarin gas were thrown over, the front line of Great Xia would be wiped out. But if he did it this time, what about the next time? What about the next time? Would it always be like this in the future? Although it seemed that many fewer people had died and everyone was happy, was such an easy victory really possible? What would the Aboriginals become if they did not experience blood and fire? He felt that he was now standing at a fork in the road of choice, and the outcome of his choice would affect the future development of that world. If they were to use poison gas to obtain victory, at the very least, he would be able to think of many disadvantages. Compared to human lives, it would have a greater impact on the Aboriginals. Such a war would no longer have much to do with the Aboriginals, and he might not necessarily gain any benefits from it. It was also hard to say how the military would view him. After all, the existence of the military had lost most of its value. And the follow-up effects would be much more than that. For example, how would the ancient race view war? They didn't need blood and fire to achieve victory. In the eyes of the Aboriginals, war and human lives had become mere things on paper. Therefore, it was better not to use this move unless it was absolutely necessary. What he wanted to do was to promote the technological development of that world and make that world what he and the Empress wanted to see. One of them was the combination of martial arts and technology to walk the path of that world. Let that world continue to develop according to its own course of war. War could make a nation stronger and able to withstand greater pressure. It could also promote the progress of human civilization. Many things would only change in an environment like war. If they didn't use poison gas to turn the war into a joke, the army would have no meaning to exist. How would they fight wars in the future? He could just throw the bottle. Of course, there was another important point. If he really poisoned hundreds of thousands of people to death, he would probably be surrounded and annihilated. For all she knew, dozens of demon-slaying and devil-subduing groups of righteous people would jump out to kill the boss. If there were people at the level of the top 10 experts, even the Empress wouldn't be able to protect herself. After all, the impact of poisoning hundreds of thousands of frontline soldiers was too great. It was far from comparable to the previous incident. When he understood this point, he felt that he had already detached himself from the dispute between the two countries. Instead, he was using a pair of hands to support the progress of that world. He was like the king of the world. Renbaqian looked out of the window with a desolate face and hummed, "How lonely it is to be invincible, how empty it is to be invincible, standing alone at the peak with the cold wind blowing continuously. Who can understand my loneliness? Your mother is calling. Your mother is calling." Renbaqian, who was feeling infinitely inflated, heard this ringtone and immediately felt like a deflated balloon. He picked up the phone and said meekly, "Mom, what can I do for you?" "Your mom is going to celebrate her 50th birthday. Do you think you should bring your girlfriend back?" Renbaqian was speechless. Let's not talk about when he would be 50 years old. How could he talk about a birthday? The people in that world were already beaten until their brains were out. Why did he still want to hold a 50th birthday celebration? He even wanted the Empress to participate? She was busy killing people now. "Mom, your 50th birthday is a big event. When is it?" "I will definitely go back to congratulate you and give you a birthday gift to make you proud," Rinpoche immediately said in high spirits. Regardless of what he thought, he had to express his attitude. Are you my biological daughter? Mama Rin looked doubtful on the other end of the phone. You don't even know when my birthday is? I've been busy recently and got confused. Aha, I will definitely go back when it is. Rinpoche laughed. After hanging up the phone, he sent a WeChat message to Ren Wanyin. When is Mom's birthday? After that, he sat there in a daze. After thinking for a while, he gave Shinfeng a call. She was the assistant he hired previously. Boss. A voice that gave people a very hard feeling came over. Just by listening to the voice, you definitely wouldn't think that she was a woman. Of course, even if you met her face to face, you wouldn't be able to tell. Rinpoche suspected that even if he stripped her naked, he wouldn't be able to tell. Is there anything that can allow long-distance communication without satellites, networks, base stations, and electricity? The further the better, Rinpoche asked. Radio stations, Shinfeng answered straightforwardly. Can that thing work? Rinpoche was surprised. He always thought that this thing required a base station. Our country's military started using it more than 80 years ago. Didn't you see radio stations used in movies about that era? Shinfeng was slightly surprised. Rinpoche thought about it. It seemed that there was such a thing, but he had forgotten about it a long time ago. Doesn't it use electricity? At that time it was hand-cranked and someone cranked it by the side. Now it's not so troublesome. Solar batteries are enough, Shinfeng explained simply. When Rinpoche heard this, he felt that he had seen a scene where a person cranked their hands to generate electricity and a person used a radio station to send messages. Oh, what's the communication range of this thing? It depends on the power output and the environment. Generally speaking, it's 15 to 20 watts. In cities, where the electromagnetic environment is more complicated, it's only a few kilometers to a few dozen kilometers. If the electromagnetic environment is good, it can reach hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. Rinpoche was delighted when he heard this. The electromagnetic environment in that world was definitely good. If he had known about this, he would have used it long ago instead of waiting until now. What was war about? It was about information. With this thing, unless it was like Xiongyu who was ambushed and killed, most people would be able to react in time. Furthermore, the mobilization of troops, support, pincer attack, encirclement, etc., could be done smoothly and without any mistakes. As long as the scouts found out about Great Xia's military situation, Dayo would be able to respond at any time and make all kinds of preparations. Give me 40 sets. Not too big and easy to operate. The longer the transmission distance, the better, Rinpoche immediately said. A few days later, he brought a pile of boxes back to Dayo with a happy look on his face. Your Majesty, I have brought back good stuff. Rinpoche came to Yangshin Palace Hall with a face full of joy. Behind him were a few guards carrying a few boxes. Oh, what is it? The Empress was curious when she saw that he was a little excited. A 100-watt shortwave radio station. It can communicate within a range of 1,000 kilometers or even more. No matter where your Majesty is, I will be able to contact you. Similarly, even if your Majesty is in Ping City, the officials in Lan City will also be able to contact you. Furthermore, a fully charged battery can be used continuously for 36 hours. Rinpoche talked non-stop about the knowledge that he had crammed for the past 2 days. After hearing what Rinpoche said, the Empress's face lit up. This thing was indeed very useful. With this, no matter when or where something happened, she would be able to know immediately. In this world, the radio station was considered a divine artifact. How many did you bring? 15 sets. Rinpoche said, leave one in Lan City, one for me, one for your Majesty, one for each of the 5 protectorates. As for the remaining 7 sets, your Majesty can arrange them as you wish. As for the remaining 25 sets, I will bring back 15 sets the next time I go back. As for the remaining 10 sets, I will probably have to go to the mountains to bring them back. At that time the guards will also send them back to the city. This thing only weighed about 5 kilograms. However, with the addition of batteries, solar panels, and the like, they wouldn't be able to bring too many at once. Chapter 327. Regardless of whether it was the Aboriginals or Great Xia, this war would be the harshest one in decades. Some people felt that using poison was a good choice, and I used to think so too. However, after thinking about it carefully, the consequences would be huge. First, the war would have little to do with the Aboriginals. 100 bottles would be enough to wipe out hundreds of thousands of Great Xia soldiers. What did the war have to do with the Aboriginals? Second, what would the military think? If Rinpoche did this, the value of the military would be halved. Third, it was estimated that the top 10 experts in the world would form a team to assassinate Rinpoche. The danger was too great. Even if he hid in the palace, the Empress wouldn't be able to protect him. Fourth, what would the Aboriginals become if they didn't experience blood and fire? After a long time, would the Aboriginals still be as valiant as they were now? After a few decades, they would become flowers in a greenhouse. Fifth, what would the young Aboriginals think of war and human life? They would not take it seriously or look down on it. A few bottles would solve the problem without blood or sacrifice. Why would they care? I think this point is very important. Sixth, and then on to the fifth point. Since the Aboriginals didn't care about war and human life, what would they think of the people from other countries? Would they kill anyone they didn't like? If the new generation of young people grew up without experiencing war, blood, and fire, and only knew that other countries allowed them to do whatever they wanted, what would happen then? One could imagine how tyrannical it would be. Seventh, war could push forward the progress of human civilization. The major changes in human history were inseparable from war. What Rinpoche wanted to do was to push forward this process of progress and not rely on himself. He wanted to wipe out everything that could be born in this world. There were still many problems with this simple list of 7 points. However, these 7 points were enough. Especially the second, fourth, fifth, and sixth points. This wasn't simply a matter of reducing the number of deaths. It was a matter of the human heart. In times of crisis, it was possible to use poison gas to influence the course of the war. Using a few hundred kilograms of poison gas at the start of the war would make it a joke. The consequences would be equally serious in the future, and it would be more serious than the death of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. Chapter 328. For the next 2 days, Rinpoche went to school during the day and spent the afternoon at the Ministry of Works. He discussed the next 2 important issues with Tong Jingye, which were the blast furnace and the steel injection method. The blast furnace used was similar to the blast furnace used in the Song dynasty. At this time, the blast furnace used was very similar to the modern blast furnace, and it used charcoal instead of coal, which was more suitable for the current Great Xia. However, the lower part was a hydraulic windmill. The wooden wheels were driven by water, and the water impacted the wooden wheels to rotate. Then, the windmill was opened and closed continuously through the axles, tension rods, and other mechanical transmission devices. The wind was stronger, the continuity was better, and the flames were more intense. This method made it easier to obtain pig iron and wrought iron, and it could be produced continuously. The molten iron flowed directly from the side without opening the furnace, and iron ore was added to the top. This alone saved a lot of manpower and resources. The next step was to use the steel injection method to hammer pig iron and wrought iron together, causing the carbon to penetrate each other to form steel. This method could increase the speed of turning iron into steel by several times. Furthermore, there was no need for craftsmen to forge the steel. This process could be done with a hydraulic forging machine, and the craftsman only needed to do the last part. With this process, the speed of forging iron and steel in Dayo could be increased by at least 10 times. The next step was to slowly develop. After all, there were many good things that couldn't be produced with Dayo's production level. See? The water flows down here, washes the wooden wheels, and the wooden wheels move the tension rods. Then, this hammer will automatically hammer down like this. Rinpoche used a small model to explain to everyone. This model was made overnight by the craftsmen over the past 2 days. A small wooden wheel was placed above a wooden trough. When water was poured from the trough, the wooden wheel would rotate with the flow of the water, completing the entire process that Rinpoche explained. I see it. Everyone in the courtyard nodded. Tong Jingye, Feng Ho, many officials from the Ministry of Works, and some craftsmen were in the courtyard. They were all staring at a wooden board placed in the middle. On top of it were the models that Rinpoche demonstrated to everyone, including the blast furnace and hydraulic forging equipment. Can these 2 types of iron be made into steel just like this? A few of the craftsmen were still hesitant. After forging for their entire lives, it was difficult for them to accept being suddenly told that they should do this. Even more people's faces lit up. Before this, they had never thought that they could actually do this. It didn't seem difficult, but if Rinpoche hadn't mentioned these things, they would never have thought of it. Especially at this critical juncture, the things that Principal Ren took out were really useful. Choose a site according to this for the time being. If there are any problems, get someone to inform me immediately. I'm going into the mountains for a period of time, or you can wait for me to come out, Rinpoche said to everyone. By the way, if we modify this water wheel a little, we can use it to irrigate the fields. Think about it. Rinpoche and Tong Jingye left together. Rinpoche said, Sir Tong, I have given you the blueprints, the model, and the things that you need to take note of. The rest is up to you. Tong Xinye nodded. He naturally knew the importance of this matter. Sir Tong, I still have something to do. Follow me to the great elder's residence first. Ren Baqin said. The two of them brought along their guards and rushed to the great elder's house. Then they were led by a servant to Shi Qing's study room. My lords. When Ren Baqin and Tong Xinye entered, they saw Shi Qing, Kuzhai, Qin Chuan, and the others surrounding a box on the table. Sir Ren, does this thing really have the effect that you said? Qin Chuan asked incredulously. He found it hard to believe that Shi Qing suddenly called him here and then told him that this thing could be used to contact people thousands of kilometers away. You will know after trying it out. I have already sent people to Jiaoda yesterday and it should be about time. Ren Baqin nodded at everyone. Jiaoda was a small city located 400 kilometers north of Lan City. What's this? Tong Xinye asked curiously. A radio station. Put one in Lan City and one in Ping City respectively. You can use this to contact each other at any time. It's like two people talking to each other without any delay. There's no need for the birds anymore. Ren Baqin's simple explanation shocked Tong Xinye. Do you see this button? This is the switch. First, turn it on and then adjust the frequency. Ren Baqin explained while reading the instruction manual. How do I use this written on this paper? Tong Xinye immediately asked. Yes. After I leave, you can find a student from the academy to tell you what's written on it. Hey. Ren Baqin called out to the box on the table. This radio station was equipped with a loudspeaker and a walkie-talkie. That's it. Qin Chuan and the others looked at the box on the table doubtfully. The radio station isn't turned on over there. Wait for a while. They will contact us when they arrive, Ren Baqin explained. After a long time, a rustling sound came from the radio station. Then someone asked doubtfully, is this how it should be used? Sir Ren seems to have said to use this. Hearing the sound coming from the box, everyone was shocked. Hey, can you hear me? Where are you now? Ren Baqin asked again. Hey, there's actually a sound. The other party was also surprised. Then they reacted and asked, is it Sir Ren? I'm Su Lu and I'm now in Jiaoda. It's done. Ren Baqin looked up and smiled at everyone. With this thing, the next battle would be easier. How to pursue, surround, and attack were all discussed through the walkie-talkie. It could be said that all the troops were connected. Where are you in Jiaoda? Qin Chuan asked in a deep voice. Following that, Qin Chuan and Su Lu asked and answered questions. Everyone heard them clearly and no longer had any doubts. Shi Qing and Zhihai were both excited and looked at Ren Baqin with a rather strange look. Why are you looking at me? Ren Baqin felt uncomfortable being stared at. Sir Ren, this thing is called a radio station? I don't know how it's done. Can our children learn these things in the academy? Shi Qing asked curiously. Of course. However, we have to take it one step at a time. They still have a lot to learn to make this thing. Ren Baqin nodded. That's good, that's good. Shi Qing stroked his beard and smiled, looking satisfied. This thing that Ren Baqin took out really showed them how amazing it was. It was even more important than the solar furnace. Sir Ren, are you still accepting students? Jikohai immediately asked after hearing this. He had a few nephews at home who were considered smart and quick-witted. Although he was previously against Ren Baqin, he immediately changed his mind when Ren Baqin took out this thing. Maybe next year or the year after. I should be recruiting another batch, Ren Baqin replied. At present there were already enough people. In at least a year, 2 outstanding students from the first batch would be selected to lead the new students. Otherwise he would be exhausted. This group of naughty children was enough to make his blood pressure rise. How many of these things are there? Zhihai asked. This question was also the concern of the others. 40 should be enough. However, only a dozen have arrived so far. The rest will take some time to arrive. Ren Baqin nodded. Leave this radio station here. If you want to contact Her Majesty or me in the future, just use it. Sir Ren, you have done a great service again this time. Tong Xinye laughed heartily with a happy look on his face. Although this thing wasn't under his control, everyone could see its importance. When you come back from the mountains, I will invite you to House Yunyan for a drink. Tong Xinye patted Ren Baqin's shoulder with his big claw. Fortunately, after reaching the man-wheel level, Ren Baqin's body had become much stronger. If it was in the past, he would have immediately collapsed. Oh, is that so? A woman's voice was suddenly heard from the radio station, causing Tong Xinye to shiver. Your Majesty? Your Majesty? Tong Xinye pointed at the radio station in surprise. He didn't expect to hear Her Majesty's voice. Wasn't Her Majesty in the palace? What's wrong with me? The Empress's voice was heard again. Tang Jingye immediately became submissive and said, I didn't expect to hear Your Majesty's voice from here. I'm too surprised and overjoyed. I hope Your Majesty won't take offense. Qin Chuan looked at Tang Jingye and laughed, ignorant old man. If the Empress hadn't spoken just now, he would have dragged Rinpoche out to drink with prostitutes, allowing him to escape this calamity. That's a public channel. Your Majesty also has a radio station so you can naturally hear it. Rinpoche smiled at Tang Jingye, revealing his white teeth. On the third day, Rinpoche had already arranged for the students in the academy. Among them, 24 had passed the test and were going on an outing in the mountains with him. The remaining 25 had to wait for their endless homework. After coming out of the academy, Rinpoche looked at the palace. The Empress would be leaving tomorrow, and he didn't know how many months she would be gone for. It seemed that during this period of time, the two of them would only be separated for a few days at most. This time they would be separated for a few months, which made him feel a little uncomfortable. After the Empress left, he would return to Earth and set off for the mountains on his way back. On the way back to the palace, Su Wei suddenly felt that the atmosphere was a little off. There seemed to be a murderous intent. This made him nervous. With a wave of his hand, everyone stopped and began to search for the source of the murderous intent. At this moment, 2 black iron chains shot out from the ground and entangled Rinpoche and the four-corned cow he was sitting on. Spirit wheel experts from Great Xia. Su Wei's facial expression immediately changed. Protect, sir. At the same time, he let out a howl to inform the palace guards nearby. Rinpoche's facial expression also changed drastically. The 2 iron chains emitted a bone-piercing chill. He felt as if he was frozen and his whole body stiffened. Then he saw a man coming down from the sky on a sword. He exerted force with his feet, and the huge sword immediately flipped in the air and landed in his hand. The sword was twice the size of his body, and it slashed toward the people below like a meteor. Rinpoche, who bore the brunt of the attack, widened his eyes and looked horrified. Then he suddenly disappeared from the scene. At the same time, the chains that entangled him and the four-corned cow also disappeared, leaving the four-corned cow in the middle of the scene with an innocent look on its face. A person 100 meters away suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood and cried out mournfully, "Where's my immortal binding chain?" Blood flowed from his mouth, his eyes were filled with horror, and his whole body was lifeless. One had to know that this iron chain was a heaven-grade weapon that was condensed from his divine sense. It was nourished by him every day and was connected to him as one. But now it was actually gone. 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 In an instant it disappeared along with the target. He couldn't sense it at all. Chapter 329. The person holding the huge sword was a middle-aged man in a green robe. The huge sword in his hand was twice as tall as him, and his whole body was like a meteor falling to the ground. As long as he could kill this person, it would be worth it even if he couldn't leave. The middle-aged man thought to himself. His eyes revealed a slight look of pity. It was a pity that he had been at the spirit wheel level for nearly 100 years, and it was difficult for him to advance further. Now that his time was almost up, he wouldn't have to do such a thing. As for the people below and Rinpoche, they were already dead in his eyes. However, just as his sword was about to hit the top of everyone's head, a scene that made his eyes widen appeared. That poison warrior actually disappeared together with another spirit wheel expert's immortal binding rope. How is this possible? The man was shocked, but the power of the huge sword increased instead of decreasing. Su Wei, who was coming up from below, was slashed into the ground. His bones were full of cracks and blood was spurting out of his mouth. His falling momentum was only slightly hindered. Su Wei, who was equivalent to the peak of the earth wheel level, was like a toddler in the face of this man's attack. He could only block it slightly before dying. With a roar, a huge gully that was 2 feet wide and 3 feet long appeared on the ground with Rinpoche at the center. Su Wei and the 4 guards closest to him were all dead. After the man landed, he swept his huge sword around in a circle, and immediately, there was a rain of blood. The guards who rushed up were all swept away and a few mounts were severed at the neck. "You're courting death." An ice-cold voice full of anger came from the palace wall. The Empress looked at the tragic scene below with bloodshot eyes. Purple veins appeared under her skin, and her hair turned from black to red. Although she rushed out of the palace as soon as she sensed the aura outside, she was still one step too late. The Empress pounced down from the palace wall at a speed that couldn't be seen by the naked eye. The man felt the immense power and monstrous killing intent of the Empress, and he slashed with his huge sword. The Empress only slightly twisted her body in the air to avoid the huge sword and grabbed the top of the man's head with her palm. Although the man sensed the Empress's movement, he was still a step too slow. He felt a sharp pain on his head and immediately groaned. The Empress already had a handful of black hair and a bloody scalp in her hands. "I want you to die a horrible death. I'm going to exterminate your entire clan." The Empress's voice was filled with boundless killing intent and brutality. Her figure flashed and appeared in front of the man. With one hand she grabbed the divine weapon that was sweeping towards her, and with the other she grabbed his face. That man let out an inhuman howl. His entire face was clawed off by the Empress. Following that, a red shadow spun around the man. The man's body was repeatedly thrown away, but he was unable to escape from the Empress's shadow. The miserable cries grew weaker and weaker. When the Empress stopped, all that was left of the man was a set of ghastly white bones. More than half of his internal organs were gone, and his flesh and blood were scattered everywhere within a radius of 100 meters. Phew. Phew. The Empress panted loudly, and the redness in her eyes didn't decrease at all. Instead, it became even more intense. The lines on his body were also more obvious. "Your Majesty," a voice called out from the side. Immediately, the Empress's eyes flickered with a red glow as she looked over. Her face turned even paler. Her exposed skin was covered with purple veins, making her look even more bizarre and seductive. "Your Majesty, Sir Rin isn't among them," Tang Xinye said carefully. Given the Empress's current state, he really couldn't take a kick. Upon hearing this, the Empress's eyes narrowed slightly. The red glow in her eyes began to weaken, and the lines on her body began to fade. When Sir Rin was attacked just now, he suddenly disappeared. Tang Xinye arrived a little later than the Empress, and the Empress took a full 10 minutes to kill that man. This was enough time for him to find out the whole story from the other Imperial guards. Upon hearing this, the Empress finally calmed down. Just now, when she was on the wall, she only saw a patch of blood below and a huge gully on the ground. She didn't even dare to look for Ren Baqian's corpse. At this moment, after hearing Tang Xinye's words, she immediately understood that Ren Baqian had returned to Earth. This filled her with ecstasy, as if she had regained the most precious thing in her heart after losing it. Her body immediately lost most of its strength. Just now, she thought that Ren Baqian had been attacked and killed. After all, with Ren Baqian's strength, he wouldn't even have the chance to escape from a great Xia spirit wheel expert. "It's a pity that 5 Imperial guards died in battle, and 7 were seriously injured," Tang Xinye said with slight regret. "Give him an extravagant burial," the Empress said after a moment of silence. "Just now, 2 spirit wheel experts attacked, and there's still one more," Tang Xinye reminded her. The Empress's eyes flashed coldly. Not far away there was another person being ganged up on. A spirit wheel expert was facing 4 high-ranking officials whose strength was equivalent to that of a spirit wheel expert. Tai Yin from the Department of Inspection, Bai Shiying from the Public Order Department, Zhu Ju from the Department of the Army, and Tao Yin from the Department of Cavalry. None of them were weaker than a spirit wheel expert, let alone a spirit wheel expert who was seriously injured and whose spirit wheel had disappeared. If it weren't for the fact that they wanted to keep him alive, that spirit wheel expert would have died 100 times over. At the side, Qin Chuan, Tu Wan, and the others were standing on top of the wall. At this moment, the Empress's condition was too terrifying, so it was better to stay here. Tai Yin and Bai Shiying's faces turned ashen. Someone actually tried to assassinate them in the city, and the assassin was Principal Ren. "You guys are courting death, yet you still want to drag us along?" The two of them had the heart to cut this person into 8 pieces. A red shadow descended from the sky and directly stepped on the shoulder of that spirit wheel expert, pinning him to the ground. The sound of bones breaking was heard, and blood spurted out of that person's mouth. It looked like he was going to die soon. The Empress looked at her feet and then coldly looked at Tai Yin and Bai Shiying. "Your Majesty." Everyone greeted in unison. "Investigate their identities. I want to exterminate their 9 generations." The Empress was overflowing with murderous intent. "Your Majesty, the other person should be Zhao Jiuchuan from the 6 Sword sect in Mount Jiazi. That sword is his heaven-grade weapon, Ju Yi," Tai Yin immediately answered. When he first arrived, he took a look and already knew who it was. After all, someone who could condense a heaven-grade weapon was considered a top expert in the world. It was unlikely that he was unknown. As for this person, "I don't know if he didn't use his heaven-grade weapon to hide his identity," Tai Yin said doubtfully. "No matter how he tried to hide his identity, he shouldn't have been beaten to death without using his trump card, right? How did such a stupid person cultivate to the spirit wheel level? How did he condense a heaven-grade weapon? His heaven-grade weapon is an iron chain, Tang Jinya said with a strange look on his face. However, he had disappeared for some reason. There are only 3 people in the Great Xia dynasty who are able to use metal chains to lock people up. Apart from Elder Zhu, who was killed by His Majesty, there's Qiu Yu from the Ministry of Justice of the Great Xia dynasty. The last person is the celestial gathering town of Jiuzi Mountain. Tai Yin answered respectfully. After all, it was impossible for Qiu Yu to appear here to assassinate the Empress. Qiu Yu's appearance didn't match either. It was said that Qiu Yu had the appearance of an elegant and handsome man. My immortal binding rope. The man at the Empress's feet struggled to squeeze out a few words from between his teeth before he breathed his last. He didn't forget the immortal binding rope even before he died. It was the foundation of his life, and he still didn't understand why it disappeared. It's indeed Luo Zhen. Tai Yin nodded. The 2 of you. The Empress pointed at Tai Yin and Bai Shiying. Your Majesty, please punish us for our incompetence, the 2 of them said in unison. The 2 of you will receive 50 scaly whips, the Empress said coldly. Even though she knew that a spirit wheel expert had sneaked in and the Public Order Bureau and the Department of Inspection wouldn't be able to detect it, she wasn't prepared to let it go so easily. This kind of scaly whip was made from the tail of a beast. When it was swung, the scales on it would explode and it was extremely heavy. An ordinary person would be badly mutilated with 1 lash. Even a spirit wheel expert would be bedridden for 3 days after suffering 50 lashes. Ren Baqian's eyes were wide open as he panted on the ground. The power of the sword strike just now was too terrifying. It gave him the feeling that if he was struck by it, not even dregs would be left. He wouldn't even need to be cremated. Even though the Empress was in the palace not far away, the enemy's sudden attack left even the Empress unable to save him in time. Fortunately, he made a prompt decision to return to Earth. He still hadn't recovered from the shock, and his heart rate soared to 180 beats per minute. After a long time, he finally regained his senses and began to rub the ground. How did he bring this iron chain back? Was this the heaven-grade weapon that the Empress mentioned? This thing was condensed from divine sense and mental strength. Yet, he actually brought it back as if it was an actual object? How was he going to untie it? Ren Baqian fell into another dilemma. This thing was binding him and he couldn't even move his fingers. Furthermore, this thing was bone-piercingly cold. He couldn't possibly be tied up like this and return to Dayo after 2.5 days, right? He would freeze to death before he could return. Chapter 330. Ren Baqian had only heard about heaven-grade weapons from the Empress, so he knew very little about them. What happened now was beyond his expectations. A heaven-grade weapon that was condensed from the spirit was actually brought to another world. Furthermore, it was in its physical form. This didn't conform to common sense. Sir, let's make a deal, shall we? Don't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Do you believe that I won't call the fire department now? Don't think that I can't do anything to you just because you're a transmigrator? Ren Baqian rubbed on the ground like a bug. After rubbing for a long time and discussing with the metal chain for a long time, the other party didn't respond at all. He was helpless. What should he do? He couldn't even pick up the phone now. His body was getting colder and colder. Ren Baqian felt that he was going to freeze. He would probably become an ice sculpture by the time he returned to Dayo in 2 days. He didn't know if he could be saved by heat. Ren Baqian was already considering whether he should think of a way to leave a message to the Empress to indicate that he could still be saved. Unfortunately, he couldn't even do such a simple thing. When exactly did the housekeeper come? Hurry up and call the police. Ren Baqian looked at the sky. It was actually evening now and immediately sighed. This is such a depressing way to die. Ren Baqian shivered. He tried to stand up but he couldn't do it. At this moment, Ren Baqian felt that he was completely frozen. If this went on, he probably wouldn't be able to hold on until tomorrow. A feeling of grievance welled up in his heart. He wasn't married yet. Just as Ren Baqian felt his body getting colder and colder, he began to recall the past. His mind was filled with the Empress. Every frown, smile, indifference, charm, and occasional naughtiness made him feel nostalgic. Unfortunately, the warmth in his heart couldn't change the coldness in his body. At this moment, the metal chain on Ren Baqian's body suddenly moved. However, Ren Baqian's body was already numb from the cold and couldn't feel it at all. However, he soon realized that the metal chain was moving around his body. This change surprised him. He didn't know what happened, but it was better than nothing. Ren Baqian carefully sensed the movement of the metal chain, trying to find a chance of survival. The metal chain circled around Rinpoche's body twice. Then it raised its head high like a snake. Following which, before Rinpoche could react, the front end of the metal chain plunged into Rinpoche's forehead. It was as if it was going to pierce through Rinpoche's forehead. The metal chain drilled into Rinpoche's forehead. In just a few seconds the metal chain pierced into his brain. F***ck what happened? Rinpoche wanted to move, but his entire body was frozen stiff. He could only move his fingers. After a long time his body recovered a little. He touched his forehead, trying to see if there was a hole there. However, the place where his fingers touched was as smooth as new. She forced herself up from the ground and walked to the bathroom with the help of the wall. She looked at her forehead in the mirror, but there was nothing on her forehead. Everything that happened just now was like an illusion. What's the situation now? Rinpoche looked at himself in the mirror and started to ponder. After a while he had a guess. The iron chain was a divine weapon. In the end it was a product condensed from the divine soul. As for the divine soul, it was probably the spiritual force or the soul, right? Rinpoche didn't know much about this and could only speculate based on the name. In that case, did this metal chain fuse with his soul? Or was it entrenched in his soul? Rinpoche didn't feel any changes in his body, but he didn't feel any changes. In that case it would remain in the soul. Don't tell me they're treating me as food? Rinpoche was shocked by this idea. This thing relied on the so-called spirit to condense. Now that it had come to this world and lost its connection with its original owner, it had entered his body. It couldn't be trying to treat him as an object, right? Or should he rely on himself to nourish it? He hoped it was the latter and not the former. After looking at the mirror for a long time, Rinpoche couldn't see anything and couldn't think of anything. Even if he returned to Dayo, the Empress might not be able to do anything. After all, he had never heard of such a thing. In the past, after the master died, the divine weapon would also dissipate. This divine weapon was brought back to Earth before its owner died, and its connection with its original owner was cut off, resulting in the current situation. That master should be dead by now, right? After all, it was impossible for the person who tried to assassinate him right next to the palace to live. If he was still alive he would be out of luck. When he returned he didn't know what would happen. After thinking for a long time, Rinpoche rubbed his head and felt a headache. He went upstairs, took out his phone and called the laboratory. Then he went downstairs and drove straight to the laboratory. He wanted to check his body to see if there were any changes. In the laboratory, Su Shan and 2 assistants were waiting for Rinpoche. After a detailed check there was nothing wrong. However, Rinpoche still didn't feel at ease. After all, he didn't know what kind of effect someone else's divine weapon would have on his body. Rinpoche only returned home when it was close to midnight. After lying on the bed, he tried his best to enter the visualization of wood. After all, he couldn't stop improving his strength at any time. This incident made him feel a real sense of crisis. However, when he entered the visualization of wood, his eyes immediately froze. He saw that the iron chain was wrapped around the big tree, pretending to be a vine. Upon closer inspection, it was exactly the same as one of the vines wrapping around the big tree, and it was mixed in with the other vines. But that dark color, that sharp charm, that bright, that outstanding, no matter how hard one tried to hide it, one would be able to recognize it at a glance. Do you think I'm blind? Rinpoche didn't know whether to laugh or cry. After standing under the tree for a long time, he began to climb up the giant tree. When he was about 2 meters up, he could already touch one end of the iron chain. When he touched it with his hand, it wasn't as cold as before. It was as if it was really an ordinary iron chain. However, that iron chain twisted slightly. It was as if Rinpoche's touch made it a little uncomfortable, but it didn't forcefully endure it and continued to pretend to be a vine. Rinpoche's hand immediately froze. When he took a closer look at the iron chain, it didn't move at all. It was as if Rinpoche was hallucinating just now. Rinpoche touched it again, but the iron chain still didn't move. Even Rinpoche started to think that it might be an illusion. At this moment, that iron chain twisted again. Rinpoche immediately had a look of surprise on his face. This thing is actually alive? However, after thinking about it, it seemed to be the case. After all, it took the initiative to burrow into his mind, which meant that it might really be alive. This made Rinpoche's mood even worse. After all, an object formed by someone else's spirit was still alive in one's soul or sea of knowledge. No one would be in a good mood. Chapter 331. After staying on Earth for 2.5 days, Rinpoche returned to Dayo once the time was up. As soon as he appeared, he saw that he was surrounded by a wall, or rather, a group of people. Dozens of burly men wearing helmets and armor widened their eyes in surprise when they saw Rinpoche suddenly appearing in the huge box that was bigger than him. He also widened his eyes and looked at his surroundings with a look of surprise. Sir Rin, Her Majesty wants you to return to the palace immediately. Xinjia, the commander of the Imperial Guards, came in through a gap in the crowd of burly men. Oh. Rinpoche nodded. It seemed like these people were waiting for him. How's the assassin? Rinpoche asked. They have been dismembered by Her Majesty and suppressed in the four corners of Lan City, Xinjia replied. Rinpoche grinned. The Empress was avenging him. What about Su Wei and the rest? Rinpoche asked again. He didn't know how those guards were doing. Su Wei, Shiying, Zhu Jia, Zhou Hu and Zhou Shu died in battle. His Majesty has already sent people to send them back to the mountains for an elaborate funeral, Xinjia replied. How about the compensation? According to the rules, Su Wei will receive 100 taels, while Shiying and the others will receive 50 taels each. They have already been sent back with the corpses. When I get back, I'll have someone send 300 taels of silver over. If there are any children in their families, you can ask them if they are willing to study at my academy, Rinpoche said after some thought. After all, this was his guard who had died to protect him. Rinpoche felt that he could still do his best. Thank you, Principal Ren. Xinjia cupped her hands and gave him a rare smile. Then she saw a black iron chain sticking out of his head like a snake. It kept swaying above his head as if it was looking around. It had an enchanting posture, twisting into an S shape one moment and a B shape the next. Everyone looked at Rinpoche's head awkwardly. What are you looking at? Rinpoche had a puzzled look on his face. He stretched out his hand and touched the top of his head. The metal chain seemed to be startled and immediately locked itself back into place. Sir Rin, there was a metal chain on your head just now. It should be the immortal binding rope, right? Xinjia pointed at the top of Rinpoche's head and asked thoughtfully. She already knew what had happened that day. Logically speaking, a divine weapon should dissipate with the death of its master. Of course, there had never been a case of a divine weapon eloping with someone before this. As a result, she didn't understand what was going on when she saw the heaven-grade weapon emerge from his body. Rinpoche was shocked. That thing actually appeared by itself? How about now? It's gone. Rinpoche felt that it might have felt familiar after returning to this world and came out for a breather. Although this idea was ridiculous, the divine weapon was a condensation of the divine soul, not a real life. No matter what, he had to see the Empress first. As everyone arrived at the front of the palace, they saw more than 1,000 giant goats standing quietly in the plaza in front of the palace. More than 1,000 horsemen were standing beside them. Rinpoche looked around and saw some familiar faces. They were the winged cavalry that had returned from Great Xia. At this moment, both parties had no intention of exchanging pleasantries. Under everyone's gaze, Rinpoche returned to the palace and headed straight for Yangxin Palace Hall. When he entered the room, he saw the Empress sitting quietly on the sofa. When she heard his voice, she turned her head and saw him. Her eyes revealed a hint of joy, but soon after, her face returned to normal. Your Majesty. These 2 days, Rinpoche missed the Empress very much, especially after he almost froze to death while waiting for death. Oh, follow me into battle, the Empress said. At this time, it was safer to be by her side. At the very least, such an incident wouldn't happen again. Rinpoche was slightly tempted, but after thinking for a while, he said, Why don't I go to the mountains to take a look first? If it doesn't work, I will go directly to the front line to see Her Majesty. If possible, I will instruct them on what to do before going to see Her Majesty. The Empress looked at him and said, In that case, be careful. I left someone behind for you. Even if you encounter an ordinary spirit wheel expert, he can protect you. I'm setting off. The Empress stood up from the sofa. She had waited here until now for Rinpoche. Once she saw him, she could leave. Your Majesty, be careful. Rinpoche cupped his hands and said. The Empress walked in front of him and looked at him carefully for a long time. Then, she pinched his chin with one hand, leaned forward slightly, and pressed her pretty face against his lips to feel the warmth of both of them. This time, their lips pressed together for a full 10 seconds. After feeling the softness and warmth of each other's lips, the Empress strode out of the palace hall. She was wearing the set of Han attire with a golden phoenix embroidered on it that Rinpoche had given her. Her hair was tied up in a bun with a hairpin. The moment she walked out of Yangxin Palace Hall, her entire aura changed abruptly like a sharp sword piercing through the clouds. Set off. The Empress said faintly to everyone outside the palace hall. Rinpoche was a little dazed in the palace hall. The soft touch on his lips hadn't dissipated, but was he in the wrong position just now? He pursed his lips and felt that it was a little sweet. A metal chain quietly emerged from his head and twisted into an S shape. After a while, it twisted into an M shape. When Rinpoche walked out of the palace hall, there was already someone waiting for him outside. Hey, let me make this clear. Although I'm protecting you under Her Majesty's orders, I only guarantee that you will see Her Majesty alive. I can't guarantee that you won't lose an arm or a leg. Rinpoche looked at the sleepy girl in front of him and was speechless. Your Majesty, is this the guard you left for me? White rabbit creamy candy, 10 pieces a day. Rinpoche stretched out his palm. I can guarantee that you won't lose an arm or a leg. 20 pieces. I can guarantee that you will see Her Majesty in 1 piece. Lin Xiaola immediately perked up. She looked like a loyal guard as she patted her small chest and said, Let's go. Where are we going? A moment later, Rinpoche stood on the city wall and watched the Empress's golden imperial carriage leave the city under the protection of the winged cavalry. Below the city wall were the officials of the imperial court. After the Empress left, Tong Jingye appeared beside Rinpoche in a flash, patted his shoulder and said, It's good that Sir Ren is fine. Rinpoche waited until he couldn't see the Empress's golden imperial carriage before turning his head and cupping his hands. Sir Tong. Sir Ren, what happened after you were attacked? Tong Jingye asked curiously. He was more curious about how Rinpoche disappeared with Luo Zhen's immortal binding rope. Have you heard of the Hearthstone? Rinpoche turned his head and asked. Never heard of it. What's that? Tong Jingye was curious and felt that he could hear some earth-shattering secret. There's a treasure in this world called the Hearthstone. Just by rubbing it, you can travel thousands of kilometers in an instant, Rinpoche said. There's actually such a treasure. I wonder if Sir Ren can broaden my horizons. Tong Jingye's face was full of envy. He didn't expect such a treasure to exist in this world. Even Lin Xiaola was staring at Rinpoche. To use the Hearthstone, you have to eat it first and then merge it with your body. When you use it, you just have to rub your little penis. Sir Tong, do you want to see it? Rinpoche squinted his eyes and asked. Tong Jingye thought about how Rinpoche rubbed his little penis the moment he was attacked. Then, I want to see it, I want to see it. A delicate voice came from the side. Lin Xiaola was excited and wanted to see what kind of treasure the Hearthstone was. Chapter 332. Rinpoche went straight to the clinic as soon as he got down from the city wall. From Tong Jingye he found out that there were 2 people in Deyo who knew the most about Great Xia. One was at the clinic and the other was at Qingxin Palace Hall. He didn't know which one was more reliable, so he went straight to the clinic. The clinic was divided into 5 ranks. The highest-ranking official was the director, who was rank 4. Below him were the physicians, and below them were the doctors, and apprentices. Apprentices were the lowest rank. Doctors were slightly better than apprentices, but in fact they were equivalent to high-level apprentices. Xing was the meaning of a scholar. Is Master Physician Qiong here? Rinpoche asked as soon as he entered the clinic. Soon he found the person he was looking for. It was an old man who looked to be in his 50s or 60s. He had dark skin and was reading a medical book in his room. Master Physician Qiong? Rinpoche pushed the door open and cupped his hands. Principal Rin? Good timing. What does this mean? Master Physician Qiong was elated when he saw Rinpoche. He had been looking for Rinpoche these days, but Rinpoche only visited the palace and the school every day. He didn't expect Rinpoche to come to his clinic. It's here. There's more at the back. Master Physician Qiong flipped the book in his hand to the front. Rinpoche looked at the content. This was the handwritten copy of treatise on typhoid and miscellaneous diseases that he had given to the Qin family. However, there was only the front part of the book and nothing else. After all, he only went there twice and the other party didn't remember much. I don't know much about these things. I'll send you a few books some other day and you can compare them, Rinpoche said immediately. The Qin family still has some books. When can you translate them? You can find the students from the school. Master Physician Qiong, I'm here to ask you something. Rinpoche didn't have the mood to do this. It was more important to get down to business. Rinpoche then told him what happened to him. You're saying that you were attacked by a spirit wheel expert and teleported thousands of miles away with the heaven-grade weapon. Because the heaven-grade weapon can't sense its original owner, it's now in your body? Master Physician Qiong was puzzled. Yes, Rinpoche replied. Is this the one on top of your head? Master Physician Xiong looked at the metal chain that was sticking out of Rinpoche's head in surprise. He had never even heard of such a thing, let alone seen it. Lin Xiaola quickly looked at the top of Rinpoche's head. Sure enough, there was a metal chain protruding from above. The top of the chain was bent down like the head of a snake looking in all directions. Above my head? Upon hearing this, Rinpoche reached out his hand to touch it. However, the metal chain immediately retracted and he touched nothing. Following which, Master Physician Xiong performed a series of checkups on Rinpoche. The Aboriginal's checkups were very interesting. Other than checking his eyes and oral cavity, Master Physician Xiong made Rinpoche drip a few drops of blood into a basin of clear water. Then, Master Physician Xiong poured a few types of liquids into the basin and observed the changes in the blood. It gave Rinpoche the feeling that this wasn't a medical examination, but rather a chemical experiment. His kidneys are filled with fluid? Not bad. Physician Xiong nodded. Rinpoche? His liver is a little inflamed and his lungs are slightly damaged, but it's not a big problem. Here, chew this and spit it out. The other party handed Rinpoche another piece of leaf. Rinpoche didn't feel anything when he put it in his mouth, but after chewing 2 mouthfuls his face twitched. His entire mouth felt astringent and numb. Don't complain about the taste. This is good stuff and I can't bear to use it on ordinary people. Seeing that Rinpoche was about to vomit, Master Physician Xiong quickly said. After Rinpoche chewed it, he spat it into a small plate. Master Physician Xiong sniffed it first and then carefully observed it. No one knew what he could see. There's nothing wrong with your soul. Master Physician Xiong used a small knife to examine the inside of Rinpoche and nodded. Then he asked Rinpoche to sit down while he sat on a chair. Currently there's nothing wrong with it. Speaking of heaven-grade weapons, everyone knows that they are formed by the spirit. When great Xia practitioners practice, the first thing they have to do is to cultivate their energy. Speaking of which, it's similar to the Aboriginals. Both of them use various methods to strengthen their bodies. The body is the foundation of all living things. However, it's different after attaining the man-will level. After attaining the man-will level, great Xia practitioners will transform their essence blood into essence qi and store it in the sea of qi. On the other hand, the Aboriginals will continue to increase the concentration of their blood and refine their marrow. When the essence qi of great Xia practitioners can be connected to the outside of their body, they will attain the earth will level. When they can sense the source energy of the earth and use it to replenish their energy, they will attain the so-called earth embryo level. Other than the sea of qi that contains essence qi, there's another place in everyone's body called the sea of consciousness. The so-called sky barrier is the process of opening up the sea of consciousness. When the sea of consciousness is opened up and connects with the heaven and earth, it will undergo a transformation. The heaven and earth energy and the soul body will form the spirit soul, which can then be called the spirit wheel. And this heaven-grade weapon is actually the product of the spirit and essence qi. Master Physician Xiong first gave Rinpoche some knowledge about the spirit. It's also because of the above that heaven-grade weapons are formed and dispersed by the person. After the death of the owner, it will dissipate. Logically, there shouldn't be a situation where it can't communicate with the owner. It's even more impossible for a situation like yours to occur. After the death of the owner, the heaven-grade weapon is left behind. Now, such a situation has already occurred. Rinpoche smiled bitterly. Master Physician Xiong frowned for a long time before saying, "There must be something that you haven't told me." Rinpoche sighed, "Although I did hide a little, it's similar to what I said. What should I do now? Can I take this thing out?" "I can't." Regardless of how it happened, that heaven-grade weapon seems to treat your sea of consciousness as its home. Perhaps after the death of its owner, it needs a place to maintain its existence. In that case, how will it affect me? I think it's alive. Rinpoche hurriedly said. This thing had already come out on its own twice. Generally speaking, heaven-grade weapons are controlled by their owners, and this has never happened before. In my opinion, since this heaven-grade weapon is formed by the spirit and essence qi, it's equivalent to a clone of its original owner. Now that the original owner is dead, it's possible for a part of its spirit to give birth to a new intelligence. However, this intelligence was born after the death of the original owner, so it wasn't affected by the original owner and is like a baby. As for the influence, Sir Ren, when you reach the spirit will level and condense a heaven-grade weapon, you should be able to drive it out. However, it's very risky. After all, the sea of consciousness isn't an ordinary place. I think you can try to see if you can communicate with it. After all, a newly born intelligence is like a baby. Perhaps you can use it for your own purposes. I can do that? Ren Baqin felt that his luck had taken a turn for the better. In the future he would be able to wield a heaven-grade weapon as a man-will expert and dominate the world? At this thought he was a little excited. After all, there's no other way, right? Even if it's a spirit wheel practitioner, it's impossible for him to probe into your sea of knowledge with a heaven-grade weapon. It's even more impossible for him to drive the heaven-grade weapon out. After all, it hasn't attacked you yet and is nourished by your sea of consciousness every day. I think it's still possible. However, there's one thing that you must take note of. Even if you can use it for your own purposes, don't ever use it. It needs the support of the spirit and essence chi in battle, and it also needs the spirit to repair itself. Sir Rin, you haven't reached the spirit level yet, so your sea of consciousness can't communicate with the heavens and the earth. If that happens, it's very likely that your sea of consciousness will be sucked dry in an instant. In the best-case scenario, your sea of consciousness will be severely damaged, and it will be difficult for you to advance in the future, Master Physician Cheong warned. In other words, there's a big boss living in my body. I have to coax him, make sure he doesn't run around, and be careful that he doesn't get hurt, right? Ren Baqin was speechless. He was a little excited just now, but he didn't expect it to be like this. More or less. Seeing that Ren Baqin understood, Master Physician Cheong smiled happily. Ren Baqin really wanted to spit in his face. After leaving the clinic, he went straight to Qingxin Palace Hall to look for Lin Xiaola's grandma, Librarian Lin. Her reaction was similar to Master Physician Cheong's. She was very surprised and looked as if she had seen an alien. After all, this kind of thing had never happened before, and she couldn't find anything even if she searched through the ancient books. In the end, her conclusion was similar to Master Physician Cheong's. Ren Baqin gave up on other ideas. It seemed like he really had to communicate with this fellow and nurture him. What are you doing here? Ren Baqin turned to look at Lin Xiaola, who was following him. To protect you. Lin Xiaola looked unhappy. Her Majesty said that she would protect you. I don't need to stay in the palace. You can go next door and rest. Ren Baqin waved his hand. Little girl, are you stupid? Although I have already confirmed that you can be bribed with 20 white rabbit creamy candies, you don't have to be this desperate, right? That's great. Lin Xiaola first yawned, then with sleepy eyes she went out as if she was sleepwalking. Ren Baqin watched as she walked out of the room, fell on the bed, and entered the visualization of wood. Chapter 333. In the early hours of the third day, before the sky was even bright, a group of knights left the west gate in 2s and 3s. Ren Baqin was waiting for them at a place not far from the city. After all, he had just been assassinated. This time he was going to the distant mountains, so he had to be extra careful. Even though the people from the Great Xia Empire's embassy were in prison and seemed to have been forgotten, no one could say that there were no Great Xia spies in the city. In particular, those merchants looked very honest. Ren Baqin was 100% sure that there were Great Xia spies among them. Ren Baqin sat in the carriage while Lin Xiaola dozed off against the wall of the carriage. There were 2 officials from the Ministry of Works in the other carriage. Surrounding them were 50 palace guards who were at least at the earthwheel level. After this assassination attempt, the Empress had raised the level of his guards, but 50 guards was the limit. In fact, if something really happened, he could only count on Lin Xiaola, who would never wake up. From time to time, young boys and girls would arrive in groups of 3. Some arrived under the protection of their servants and were then sent away. How many people have arrived? Ren Baqin lifted the curtain and asked. Sir, 22 people have arrived, someone immediately replied. This person was Ren Baqin's new guard captain and was also someone he knew. Sure, who? Call me when everyone has arrived. Ren Baqin nodded. After another 15 minutes, the sky was already bright, and the last 3 people finally arrived. Ren Baqin gave the order and the entire team set off. As they got further and further away from Lan City, Ren Baqin began to relax. At this point, it wouldn't be easy to be discovered. In fact, in the southern part of Dayo, where the remnant citizens of the Hao nation were located, there were slightly more merchants from other countries. In the north, there were only a few cities such as Lan City. It was extremely difficult to encounter them in the wilderness. Behind the carriage, there were many cheerful conversations and noises from the students. Occasionally, Tong Lan's silvery bell-like voice could be heard. Even though her tone was always fierce and full of malice, not many people cared. After traveling for a day, Ren Baqin constantly shifted between the carriage and the fork-horned cow. The carriage was too bumpy, and the fork-horned cow was uncomfortable, so he kept shifting between the 2 positions. At this point in time, Ren Baqin was a little envious of Lin Xiaola. She could actually sleep so soundly in the carriage. Regardless of whether it was bumpy or noisy, nothing could disturb her sleep. She only crawled out at lunchtime and ate 10 times more food than Rinpoche before going back to sleep. Rinpoche suspected that she might still be sleeping when he was beaten to death. After setting up camp and having dinner, Rinpoche had nothing to do and switched on the radio station. "Is His Majesty here?" After a while he heard the Empress's voice. "What happened?" "It's nothing. I just want to know where Her Majesty is, whether she ate well and whether the journey was tiring." Rinpoche laughed. To put it simply, he was just flirting. The Empress was speechless. After a long while Rinpoche thought that the Empress had turned off the radio. Then he heard her reply, "We have arrived at Gu City. What did His Majesty have for dinner? I see that Your Majesty didn't bring along any chefs from the imperial kitchen. I wonder if Your Majesty can get used to the food?" Rinpoche continued to tease her. "There's no need to be so particular when the army is outside," the Empress replied. "How can we do that? Your Majesty is the ruler of a nation. Even if the army is outside, you can't be careless. I'll get the imperial kitchen to chase after Your Majesty." Rinpoche was stunned. He didn't even have the time to speak. "Who is this?" "Who is it?" Rinpoche asked. "I'm Shi Qing," the other party said. "So it's Sir Shi. This thing is quite useful. I can actually hear Sir Shi from so far away," another person said. The voice was magnetic and belonged to a middle-aged man. Rinpoche was speechless. "Who is it this time?" "Is it Sir Rin, the principal of Black Bamboo Academy? I've heard of your name for a long time." "I'm Li Qianxiu. I've heard of your name for a long time, but I didn't expect to meet you under such circumstances," the voice said. Rinpoche immediately knew who this person was. He was the Protector General of the Center, Li Qianxiu, one of the 5 Protectors General. "So it's Sir Li. This thing is indeed good. Your Majesty, I'll get someone to inform the palace," Shi Qing said. "So Your Majesty is here too? Your subject, Li Qianxiu, greets Your Majesty. May I know where Your Majesty is?" Li Qianxiu seemed to have heard caretaker Shi's words when he arrived. Now that he heard that the Empress was here, he quickly greeted her. "Greetings, Your Majesty. I'm Shi Wangu. Due to my duties, I'm unable to personally visit Your Majesty. I hope Your Majesty will forgive me. There's no need for formalities. Are there any unusual movements in the south?" the Empress asked faintly. "Those people have been restless. These days I've beheaded another batch of them and finally made them behave. However, this is only on the surface. There are still people secretly colluding with each other. Among them, Great Xia, the Yun nation, and the other nations are definitely working hard. Once I catch them, I'll definitely catch them all in one fell swoop," Shi Wangu said coldly. "Li Qianxiu, how's your situation?" the Empress asked again. "I've already arrived at Qinghe Stream, and the vanguard has already reached Ping City. The Great Xia army is currently divided into 5 groups. 2 of them are surrounding Ping City and Shun City respectively, while the other 3 are heading for Yuxing, Koka, and Liao City respectively. Koka and Liao City have 1,000 garrison soldiers and 2,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the North who retreated from Ziyue City, as well as tens of thousands of civilians. Yuxing only has 1,000 soldiers, and I'm afraid it'll be difficult to stop the attack of the Great Xia army. I've already dispatched 1,500 soldiers to Yuxing City overnight, but I'm not sure if they can make it in time," Li Qianxiu said in a deep voice with a tinge of worry. Rinpoche watched as they turned the radio station into a chat group. Some were greeting and some were talking about military affairs. Although this was the original purpose, he still felt that it was a little strange. Furthermore, none of them spoke before. Just as he greeted the Empress, all of them jumped out. "What do you want?" Rinpoche listened to everyone talking in the radio station. Lin Xiaola was awakened by the noise. She forced her eyelids open and asked, "Why is it so noisy? Who's talking?" "Continue sleeping," Rinpoche said as he patted her head gently. Lin Xiaola's throat emitted a whooshing sound like a cat's. She swatted his paw away, changed her position, and continued to sleep. Not long after, she was even drooling. After a long while, Li Qianxiu and Shiwanya left because they were busy with official business. Seeing that no one was talking, Rinpoche asked, "Is Her Majesty still around?" "Yes," the Empress replied. "Although I can't see Her Majesty now, I can see the same starry sky as her. I feel that we are much closer now." Rinpoche continued to tease her. Nearly 500 kilometers away, the Empress opened the window and looked at the sky above her head with a smile on her face. "The stars are really bright today, but it looks like the wind is about to pick up. It might rain tomorrow. Shi Qing's voice suddenly came from the radio station. Rinpoche couldn't help but want to strangle him. Why didn't he feel that this old man was so annoying in the past? A metal chain quietly stretched out from the top of Rinpoche's head. It looked around in all directions before extending the front end out of the carriage window. It seemed to be very curious about the outside world. Chapter 334. At noon the next day, a group of people arrived at Nine Peaks Mountain. Rinpoche alighted from the carriage. While instructing the guards to look for the Luoyang horn, he raised his head and sized up the mountain range in front of him. The peaks overlapped each other and he didn't know exactly how big it was. However, it looked extremely vast. The tall trees and dense primeval forest filled the area with a savage aura. The 9 tallest peaks in the distance seemed to reach the sky. Presumably this was the origin of the name Nine Peaks Mountain. Melodious bird cries could be heard from the forest, and from time to time, a few birds could be seen flying out of the forest. "Teacher? What are we doing here?" Shurgan approached Rinpoche and asked. The other students got off their mounts and stretched their bodies. Tong Lan stood on the back of the horned cow and looked into the distance. Her clothes fluttered in the wind and she looked like a little fairy. Unfortunately, she was a little fairy with short legs. "You will know very soon," Rinpoche turned his head and said. The history books of later generations recorded that in the year 71 of Dayo's calendar, the great pioneer, scientist, and educator Rinpoche brought 24 disciples with him to Nine Peaks Mountain and successfully developed well salt, solving the problem of salt consumption for the people of Dayo. In Rinpoche's mind, this should be the picture above. However, in order to prevent himself from being slapped in the face, Rinpoche felt that it was better not to say too much. Very quickly the Luoyang horn was found. Just a few hundred meters away there was a 1.5-meter tall wooden stake that was as thick as a bowl. At the top of the wooden stake, there was a curved horn that was 2 feet long. One end was thick while the other end was thin. The horn was brown in color and there were red rings on it, dividing the horn into sections. "This horn is good stuff." Shurhu picked up the horn and caressed it. "What do you mean?" Rinpoche asked curiously. "The Luoyang horn has 1 ring every 8 years and there are 16 rings on this horn. This means that this Luoyang has lived to at least 100 years old," Shurhu said. Rinpoche nodded. It was similar to the annual rings of a tree. Rinpoche was already very surprised that Shurhu could come up with a number of more than 100 in such a short time. Shurhu was very talented in mathematics. Following which, Shurhu put the end of the horn into his mouth and blew hard. The sound wasn't as deep and resounding as the horn. It was very sharp and it went straight to the sky. Rinpoche covered his ears. The sound of this thing was really loud, and it was especially sharp as it drilled straight into his head. After the bugle horn sounded for a long time, a long howl came from the distance. It was the sound of a human. It means that they heard it. "They are coming down the mountain to pick up their friend," Shurhu said to Rinpoche. "What if the enemy comes?" Rinpoche asked curiously. "If it's the enemy they will play a different tune. There's a special technique to play this tune. Foreigners don't know how to play it, and the aboriginals won't do something like pretending to be friends," Shurhu explained. Rinpoche had always felt that it was hard to fathom a person's heart. All was fair in war and anything could happen. However, such a thing rarely happened in the ancient race. Perhaps it had something to do with the fact that most people were relatively simple-minded. Of course, this was just a joke. In fact, the aboriginals had their own set of etiquette and rules of conduct that everyone had to abide by for many years. Furthermore, the aboriginals were rather down-to-earth, so there were very few who would go against the rules. This was also related to the fact that it was not easy for the aboriginals to live in the mountains. If their reputation was ruined, they would be ostracized by the surrounding villages. When they encountered difficulties, they wouldn't even have a helper and would gradually disappear into history. After a long time, some rules had become ironclad and everyone had to abide by them. This was the case even after they left the mountain. After waiting for more than an hour, another long howl came from the forest ahead. This time it was much closer and was only a few hundred meters away. "This is to confirm the identity of the person who is coming," Shurhu explained. Following which he also let out a long howl. After another quarter of an hour, the sound of plants swaying could be heard from the forest. Following which 2 figures gradually emerged from the forest. "Are you Her Majesty's men?" one of them shouted. Both of them looked to be in their 30s or 40s. Their upper bodies were covered with bronze-colored muscles, and they wore a necklace made of animal teeth on their necks. They also carried longbows on their backs. These are the principal of the Black Bamboo Academy, Sir Ren, and his disciples. I am a 4th grade palace guard. This is my token. Sherhu flashed a token in his hand. The two of them walked out of the forest and didn't look at Sherhu's token. Instead they sized up the crowd. He's not an aboriginal? One of the burly men pointed at Rinpoche and asked. Sir Ren is the husband chosen by Her Majesty and the principal of the Black Bamboo Academy. Your village isn't far from Lan City, so you should have heard of him, Sherhu replied. Oh, so it's him. That man scratched his head. I have heard them mention it before, but I didn't really believe it. He then sized up Rinpoche and shook his head. Too skinny. He was obviously puzzled as to why Her Majesty would choose such a weakling as her husband. In fact, Rinpoche was 175 meters tall and weighed almost 180 kilograms. Over the past few months he had been practicing martial arts and taking beatings every day, and his body had bulged out. On Earth he would be considered a burly man. However, in the eyes of these aboriginals, he was still too skinny like a woman and didn't conform to their aesthetic standards of men. In the eyes of these men who had arms that could run horses, Rinpoche would only be considered normal. I have seen a girl named Nagu in your village before. Rinpoche thought for a long time before recalling the girl's name. Back then I said that I would pay you a visit. Is that so? That burly man continued to scratch his head. What's your purpose for coming here? Another burly man looked around and asked. There were more than 70 people in this group. Other than Rinpoche, the rest were aboriginals who wore leather armor and carried long swords on their backs. In Dayo, those who could carry such long swords were either rich or officials. For an ordinary person, a short sword could already be considered a family heirloom. However, they didn't show much fear. Just like the aboriginals that Rinpoche met on Mount Damo, they didn't fear the officials. They didn't even show much respect. It was as if they were looking at someone from another village. Most of the people in the mountains were like this. After all, decades ago the late emperor also came from the mountains. Only by coming into contact with more knowledge from the outside world in the city would they more or less show some respect. I heard that you have a black pool here. I want to take a look, Rinpoche said. What's there to see about that poisonous pool? The burly man muttered. Then he said to everyone, follow me, but I can't bring that thing up. He pointed to the carriage path. Just throw it at the foot of the mountain, Rinpoche said nonchalantly. Then, the burly man led everyone to the side and explained, it's more convenient to come down from that path just now. It's easier to go up the mountain by another path. After walking a few hundred meters to the side, the burly man went into the forest. Rinpoche got someone to move the radio station, solar panels, and other things. 2 people were left to look after the carriage. Then he began to walk into the woods one step at a time. The students behind him immediately jumped up and down like a group of monkeys when they entered the woods. Tong Lan stepped on the tree trunk twice and climbed up a branch. Then she gave Rinpoche a performance of Mount Tai. Tong Lan stepped on the tree trunk twice and climbed up the branch. Following which she put on a show of Mount Tai, the mother of the apes. Come and chase me. Tong Lan immediately scuttled to another tree, turned her head and smiled at the students behind her. She leaped forward and used one hand to prop herself up on the branch below her. Her whole body flipped in the air and landed on another tree. Then she leaped again and didn't forget to make a face at Rinpoche, who was moving forward step by step. Rinpoche looked up and saw her making a face. He conveniently picked up the camera hanging around his neck and watched as she got closer and closer to the tree trunk. He watched as she got closer and closer to the tree trunk. Boom! The tree trunk, which was so thick that 2 people would need to hug it, shook a leaf, and 2 unlucky snakes fell from the tree trunk. Tong Lan slapped the tree trunk and landed on another branch. She covered her nose with one hand and tears welled up in her eyes. She was trying her best not to cry. She was a genius, so how could she cry? Rinpoche put down the camera with a satisfied look. He had captured another piece of her dark history. After walking for about 100 meters in the forest, a small path appeared in front of them. It wasn't known if it was made by humans or beasts. From time to time, the sound of small animals running away could be heard from the bushes at the side, which always attracted a few students to chase after them. After a while they saw Du Laolu returning with an animal that looked like a deer. Its big eyes were filled with tears and it looked delicate and lovely. Tong Lan immediately jumped down from the tree and exclaimed, "So cute." "It's quite cute." Rinpoche nodded. "We will eat it tonight." Okay. Lin Xiaola, who was still sleepwalking, almost drooled when she heard about eating. After walking for more than 4 hours, they walked out of the forest and saw a wooden fence in the distance as well as an open wooden gate. Inside the wooden fence they could see 2 tall turrets. In front of them was a small stream. The clear and transparent water made everyone feel a little refreshed. Many students excitedly ran over to wash their faces and drink the water when they saw the stream. After walking for so long in the forest and jumping up and down like monkeys for half a day, they were all thirsty. Before they could get over their excitement, they saw a student swinging his hand and biting a fish that was slightly bigger than his finger. Finger-biting fish tastes good, but it's too small. The aboriginal who was leading the way looked at the small fish in the student's hand and laughed. Tastes good? Ren Bachin touched his chin. He hadn't really eaten fish in Dayo. Is there a lot of fish? Are they easy to catch? Ren Bachin asked. Quite a lot. If you want to catch them, put your finger in the stream and they won't let go. When the harvest isn't good, the children in the village will also come here to catch them. Ren Bachin looked at the students around him and felt that he would soon be able to taste this fish that was said to taste good. Chapter 335. Why are we doing this? One of the students muttered speechlessly. A row of 23 students squatted on both sides of the stream with their hands in the water. After a while, they quickly pulled their hands out and plucked a small fish from their fingers. Even though this fish was small, it was still quite painful to bite. Yagüe said that we can get extra points for the final exam. Another student said. You guys don't have the spirit of an aboriginal warrior at all, Tong Lan said disdainfully as she sat on a rock nearby. It's better than those who do homework, another student laughed. Thinking of the 25 people who were working hard at home, everyone felt much better. What do you think would happen if we put Ding Ding in? Du Laolu whispered to the person beside him. The youth beside him almost spat out his saliva. I want to know too. Why don't you give it a try? The youth instigated with an embarrassed look. Forget it, I'm just saying. Du Laolu laughed dryly. This kind of fish will bite anything that's as thick as a finger, right? Why don't you get some meat strips? A young girl asked. Du Laolu, where's that cutie you caught? She felt sorry for her fingers. Yagüe confiscated it and said that it would be an extra for dinner, but we won't get a share. Du Laolu expressed his helplessness. Tong Lan, does your nose still hurt? Du Laolu touched on her sore spot. The next second he was kicked into the stream by Tong Lan. Even though it didn't look deep, the water reached one's waist. Du Laolu flopped in the water for a long time before he stood up. His miserable howl could be heard far away. He had 3 finger-biting fish on his fingers, but this wasn't important. What was important was that he reached under his pants and pulled one out. Du Laoyo's face turned green. Aboriginal men were usually dressed in robes or shorts. Due to the hot weather, they were usually naked underneath. Renbachin was currently in the village. It wasn't big and only had a few dozen wooden houses. All of them were about 1 meter above the ground, mainly to prevent reptiles from entering. There were more than 200 people in the village. At this time, most of the young and strong people had split into 2 groups to hunt, leaving behind only the elderly and children, as well as a few guards to protect against wild beasts. One of them was the one who took over from Renbachin. At this moment, the elders in the village had already left. Renbachin was in a wooden house that had just been vacated for him. The other guards had already gone out to cut down trees and come back to build a small hut. The ironware in the stockade village was very precious, so they were reluctant to use it to cut down trees and build houses. The protectors did not have that many scruples. Renbachin sat on the ground and switched on the radio. Just as he switched it on, he heard someone talking. It was Li Chenxiu and a weak voice talking about military affairs. Renbachin heard them talking about the movements of the Great Xia army. That weak voice should be Hong Wu's. He coughed from time to time as he spoke, and his voice was far from his usual high-spirited self. It seemed like his injuries were really serious. Renbachin listened for a while and didn't interrupt. After he had rested enough, he switched off the radio and turned to pack up some other things to bring up the mountain. For example, some glass bottles were made by the glass factory. They were used to hold the brown water from the black pool and the other mountain crevice. After the water was collected, it could be sent back to Earth for testing to see if it was what he thought it was. While he was packing, Lin Xiaola was hugging that fawn with a pair of big watery eyes tightly. She was drooling as she slept. That little thing was about to suffocate from her strangling. In the evening, more than 30 strong young men came back from outside with game on their shoulders. From afar, they could see more than 20 young men and women squatting by the stream. There was also an exquisite girl dressed in white sitting on a rock and swinging her legs. "Who are you?" a man who looked to be in his 40s asked. "We are from the Black Bamboo Academy and came with our teacher. Our teacher is the husband chosen by Her Majesty." Shurgan stood up and cupped his fists. It's that person, right?" A young girl with a head full of pigtails was surprised. She often went to Lan City with her brother and heard a lot about Lan City. She guessed that the husband chosen by the Empress was the man who looked like a swindler. After all, he seemed to be the only foreign official in Dayo, but it was just a guess. However, he hadn't come for a long time, so she thought that he had already forgotten about him. She only remembered him every time she entered Lan City and heard someone mention him. "It's the one we saw last time." "It should be him," Nagu said as she pulled her brother. "We still don't know if it's him or not," Nagu's brother said in a deep voice. Very soon, everyone saw Rinpoche. He was taking a stroll in the courtyard when he saw a group of Aborigines carrying game from afar. One of the game was particularly eye-catching. It was the size of a small mountain and required 2 people to carry it. The people here were called black-faced men, but they were actually wild boars. "It's really you." A girl with a head full of pigtails jumped out from the group. She was carrying 2 of the small animals that Du Laolu had caught. "Miss Nagu." Rinpoche smiled and greeted her. "I thought you had forgotten." Nagu muttered, "Are you going to hire me? Last time, we agreed to pay half a kilogram of salt a day." "I can't forget." Rinpoche smiled. The 2 of them chatted for a while. Then Rinpoche watched the people in the stronghold clean up the game. When the sky turned dark, another group of Aborigines returned from the mountains. The game they hunted was much worse than the previous group. These Aborigines completely depended on the weather. If they were lucky, they would be able to get enough food for a few days. If they were unlucky, they wouldn't be able to bring back much food. At night, a rather grand bonfire party was held in the stronghold. The Aborigines were simple and honest. Since there were guests, they took out all the food that could be used to entertain them. Upon seeing this, Rinpoche also took out some seasonings and even made a stewed river fish. The taste was extremely delicious, but it was a pity that few people liked it except for him. Sitting on a wooden stool, he held a bowl of fish soup and sipped it. The sound of drums resounded in the hall. There was also an elder playing a musical instrument made of animal bones. It sounded a little like Insun, and the sound was simple, deep, and distant. Around the bonfire, the Aborigines were dancing a very primitive and wild dance. The girls in the stronghold were all wearing short skirts and blouses made of animal skin. Their long legs and navels were exposed, showing off their strong and slender body curves. Rinpoche felt that it would be better if there weren't those burly men who were wearing animal skin underpants and showing off their hairy legs. However, the others were affected by the cheerful atmosphere in the stronghold. Many students went down to dance, and there were actually a few who danced quite well. For example, Du Laolu and 2 female students. "Why aren't you going down?" Rinpoche asked without turning his head. Not far away from him was the short-legged Tong Lan. "Childish." Tong Lan looked disdainful, but her eyes were sparkling. "It's not childish. Besides, if you don't do it now, you might not have the chance in the future," Rinpoche said casually. With Tong Lan's status, there weren't many opportunities for her to do this kind of aboriginal dance. She was like a little adult at such a young age, and she probably wouldn't do such things in the future. "Umph." Tong Lan snorted through her nose and ignored him. Rinpoche felt a little regretful. He originally wanted to take the opportunity to take a picture, but the little girl wasn't moved. It was unknown when the metal chain had drilled out of Rinpoche's head. It swayed along with the music and finally tied itself into a knot. The thing on Rinpoche's head immediately attracted Tong Lan's attention. "Hey, what's on your head?" Tong Lan asked curiously. "Uncle," 2 sounds, long tone. Rinpoche didn't need to think to know that it was that fellow again. Chapter 336. The next day, Rinpoche led the students and the Aborigines up the mountain. Originally, the harvest that day was enough to feed the village for 3 days. However, with the addition of Rinpoche and his team, the Aborigines had no choice but to go up the mountain again the next morning. The forest on 9 Peaks Mountain was very dense. Except for a few open spaces, it was difficult for sunlight to penetrate most of the places. Only the scattered light from the leaves shone like a beam of light. The soil on the ground was fertile. Over the years, the leaves had rotted on the ground and seeped into the soil, making the soil very fertile. "There isn't much prey around the Black Pool. We have to head northwest into the mountains. Nagu will bring you there." After crossing a mountain, the leader of the hunting team, Tahu, said to Rinpoche. They were still on the outskirts of Nine Peaks Mountain, and there was still a large area inside. That was the center of Nine Peaks Mountain and also the place with the most prey. Correspondingly, the danger was greater. Wild boars the size of a hill like the one from yesterday might be awe-inspiring in other places, but they were nothing in here. I hope you will return with a fruitful harvest. Rinpoche cupped his hands. I hope so. Tahu laughed heartily. Nagu, bring them there. Got it. Remember to bring me a handful of mountain radish. I've been craving it lately, Nagu said straightforwardly. Soon after, everyone parted ways and bade each other farewell. Rinpoche looked at the straightforward men with their hairy legs carrying bows, sticks, and nets as they headed in another direction. This group of 20 to 30 people had a total of 4 iron knives, one of which was a short knife. Their bows were made from bone arrows, which were made from the bones of a type of beast, and were very useful. There were 10 arrows made from iron arrowheads that Tahu regarded as treasures and wouldn't use easily. Rinpoche, the students, and the guards followed Nagu and headed southwest. How far are we going? Rinpoche asked. Just climb over that hill in front of us, Nagu said as she pointed ahead. Rinpoche looked ahead and only saw dense trees, vines, and weeds that were as tall as a human. They blocked everything in front and he couldn't see very far. Are you the husband chosen by Her Majesty? Nagu asked Rinpoche curiously after walking for a while. Although this should be the case, she still found it hard to believe. Do you want to know why? Rinpoche knew what she was thinking just by looking at her eyes. Most of the Aboriginals couldn't keep their thoughts to themselves. Whenever they had a question, they would want to ask it, regardless of whether it was appropriate or not. Nagu's brain was like a little chick pecking at grains. It's probably because I'm handsome. Rinpoche touched his face. Bah. This sound came from Tonglan, who had pricked up her ears. What else could it be? Rinpoche asked. Everyone opened their mouths, but they were suddenly speechless. Rinpoche's looks were still slightly better than his weak skills. What does Her Majesty like about him? More knowledgeable? Most of them acknowledged this in their hearts. However, after interacting with him for so long, they knew his character very well. He was waiting for them to say this. But if he didn't say it, it would mean that he was handsome. This was very painful. For a moment, everyone was in a dilemma. Rinpoche looked at everyone's constipated expression and chuckled. Then he said sternly, There's always a reason to hate someone. There is no reason to like someone. It was filled with the smell of chicken soup. However, everyone really believed him, especially Du Laolu, who already had someone he liked. He deeply agreed with these words. Except for Tonglan, who had a look of disdain on her face. Other than the things that were taught in class, she firmly opposed everything that Rinpoche said. She firmly agreed with everything that Rinpoche didn't agree with. This was a matter of principle. Unless Rinpoche could defeat her. After walking for a long time, they finally climbed over the top of the mountain. Standing on the top of the mountain and looking down, they saw a sea of green. As the wind blew, they could hear the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the roars of beasts. This was a kingdom of life. It's there. Nagu stood on a rock and pointed in a direction. In the midst of the green there was a small black spot. That was the location of the black pool. We still have to walk a long way. Rinpoche used his hand to block the dazzling sunlight and looked in that direction. Walking in the forest was much slower than walking on flat ground. There were weeds and vines everywhere, and they had to be careful of venomous snakes that were hiding in unknown places. Not to mention they had to make a big detour to get to a place that looked very close. The black pool was only a few kilometers away from where they were now, but it would take them 4 to 6 hours to get there. Just as Rinpoche expected, they had to walk for a full 4 hours before they arrived at the location that they saw at the top of the mountain. When they were a few hundred meters away from the pool, the surrounding environment had already begun to change. The towering trees, which required 2 people to wrap their arms around, had become very short. The leaves on many of the trees were somewhat wilted. It seemed like they were affected even at such a distance. After walking out of the forest, there was a pool that was dozens of meters in diameter in front of them. The pitch-black surface of the pool was calm and without any signs of life. Surrounding the pool was different from the black soil on the mountain. Instead, it was a type of yellow soil that was sparsely covered with short weeds. This is the black pool. Even without Nagu's explanation, Rinpoche already knew that they had arrived. They could already smell a rotten egg smell that made people want to cover their noses. If he wasn't mistaken, this should be the smell of hydrogen sulfide. Rinpoche walked to the side of the pool. The water was almost black and it was impossible to tell how deep it was. What are we doing here? Tong Lan followed behind and asked curiously. This question had been on everyone's mind for a few days. Previously, Shurgan had also asked this question, but Rinpoche had never answered it. Rinpoche lowered his head and dipped his finger into the pool water to take a look. The color was very dark and there were many black impurities in it. It looked very dirty. He gently licked it with his tongue. It was very salty and had a little bitter taste which made his face twitch. Bottles? Rinpoche first asked the guards to bring the prepared bottles. A total of 5 bottles were filled and sealed tightly. Do you know that the earth can move? Rinpoche turned his head and asked everyone. How can the earth move? Before Nagu could finish her sentence, someone beside her said, whether the earth moves or not depends on what is used as a reference. That's right. However, even from the perspective of an ordinary person, the earth is also moving. Beneath the earth are the tectonic plates that make up the earth, and they will make all kinds of movements. One of the most direct examples is an earthquake. When the interior of the earth moves and certain conditions are met in a certain area, an earthquake will occur. Rinpoche took the opportunity to give a lecture to the students. Then why does the earth move? A student immediately asked. Rinpoche picked up a stone, let it go, and it fell to the ground. That's how it works. Objects will fall under the influence of gravity, and the earth will also be affected. Chapter 337. No. That's not what I meant. The earth will be affected by this force, but the movement isn't limited to falling. I'll talk about this in the future, but you just have to have this concept first. To put it simply, when the earth moves, it will form all sorts of situations. For example, a protruding mountain range turning the ocean into a plain, raising the mountain range to the ground, and so on. Of course, this takes a long time and is measured in tens of thousands of years. One of them is that the ocean becomes a plain or a mountain, and the seawater is swallowed underground before it can evaporate. After countless years, some changes occur and are finally discovered by humans, Rinpoche said. Teacher, do you mean that this place was originally an ocean? Shurgan asked. Rinpoche's words were too surprising. This was the inland of Dayo, and one had to travel thousands of kilometers to reach the seaside. This place was originally an ocean? Didn't that mean that Dayo and the Yun nation were originally located in the ocean? That's possible, but it's just a guess. We still have to see the composition of the black water in this pool to know. Rinpoche nodded. Everyone was speechless at first, then asked, Then? Is this what we are trying to prove? Then you should know that salt is obtained from seawater. As soon as Rinpoche said this, everyone was shocked and asked, Salt can be produced here? Dayo was short of salt and even children knew this. Most of the salt had to be transported from other countries. If salt could be produced here, it would mean something. Most of these children knew what it meant. That depends on the composition of the water here. Rinpoche didn't say too much, but the light lick just now proved that there was salt in the water. They just needed to see if they could produce edible well salt. How do we know what the composition of the water is? Everyone asked. What's chemistry used for? It's used to analyze, transform, and extract substances. However, you are still very far from here. I'm here to bring you on an outing. Rinpoche laughed. He then asked Nagu, Has this place ever dried up? I don't know. Nagu was a little confused. She didn't understand most of what these people said just now, but she felt that it was very impressive. Bring me the rope, Rinpoche shouted behind him. He wanted to test the depth of the pool. Soon he tied a head-sized stone to one end of the rope and threw it into the water. With a splash, a lot of water splashed. Other than the rock, there were no signs of life in the pool. Sir, it has stopped. The guard lowered the rope for about 5 meters before. Find a branch and push the rope forward. Try to make it land in the center and test a few more places. After Rinpoche gave his instructions, a student ran off to find a branch. Although Rinpoche wasn't too sure about it, the possibility of producing salt made them all excited. If he could really do it, it would be a huge thing. If that was possible, it would be a big deal. After completing these calculations, Rinpoche took notes. Following which, he wanted to go to the mountain stream with the light brown water. In the direction they are going, it will take them a day to get there. It will take us at least a day and a half to get there, Nagu said. Rinpoche calculated the time. It seemed that he had to return to Earth first before going there. Everyone went back. Along the way, they heard the sound of small animals and the guards went to look for them. After all, mosquito legs were still meat. There wasn't much food in the village and it was best to eat some themselves. After returning to the village, Rinpoche arranged for half of the guards to build houses and the other half to go hunting. At night, Rinpoche woke Lin Xiaola up. I'm going to rub a hearthstone. Do you want to watch? Rinpoche felt that he had to tell Lin Xiaola. Otherwise she would go crazy when she woke up and realized that he was gone. Although this girl was silly, she could be quite honest sometimes. What's a hearthstone? Lin Xiaola forced her eyes open and looked confused. Rinpoche was speechless. Anyway, I'm going to leave for a day. Don't worry, Rinpoche said. No, Her Majesty asked me to protect you. Lin Xiaola finally woke up. The place I'm going to is a national secret. Her Majesty knows about it. Just wait here. Rinpoche waved his hand. He took a bottle of water from the black pool and walked to a corner of the room. With the thought of going back, he disappeared in an instant. At the moment when he disappeared, Lin Xiaola felt a slight fluctuation in the air. Her eyes lit up and she pounced at him like a lioness. However, she pounced on empty air and all she caught was air. Yeah. Lin Xiaola was slightly surprised. She reached out and grabbed the air again, but there was still nothing. Where is he? That's amazing. Her Majesty asked me to protect him. If he dies somewhere else, you won't blame me, right? He still owes me candy. Lin Xiaola muttered to herself. She leaned against the wall and sat down. She stared at the place where Rinpoche disappeared and couldn't open her eyes for a few minutes. After returning to Earth, Rinpoche first contacted Yang Sun to arrange a laboratory. He then rushed to Shanghai with the bottle. Even if he found someone else, they would find out anyway. He might as well let them test it and save himself some trouble. Seeing that Rinpoche had brought a bottle of water, Yang Sun was excited. After half a day, the test results came out. Yang Sun was astonished and asked, "Is this brine? What are the ingredients in it?" Rinpoche asked. Yang Sun immediately handed the results to him. Rinpoche glanced at it and saw a bunch of Na KCMG Li BRICL-SO2, 4CO3-B2O3 HCO3 and so on. 4CO3-B2O3 HCO3 and so on. He couldn't even remember what most of them were. He reckoned that his chemistry teacher's coffin was about to explode again. What are these? Rinpoche decided to ask shamelessly. Yang Sun was speechless. Get a researcher here to explain to Mr. Ren. Yang Sun immediately connected the internal call. Rinpoche asked him, but who could he ask? It was someone from the research lab who asked that question just now. Not long after, a cold-looking, bespectacled young man came up and gave the two of them a good lesson. The final conclusion was that these were the ingredients of the black brine. There was nothing special about it and it was a waste of their time to bring it to the research lab. There's nothing else in it? Rinpoche felt a little strange. After all, it was a product of another world. There should be some differences, right? Even if the soil that was brought over previously contained many microorganisms that weren't found on Earth. Although there are some, they aren't very valuable. Those microorganisms can only give us a little more understanding of the ecology of the target world. The other components aren't much different from the black brine and don't match our expectations. Simply put, this is the black brine of another world, the young man said as he pushed up his glasses. Rinpoche secretly gave him a thumbs up after he left. He knew the truth and was worthy of being from the research lab. He was indeed different from a dabbler like Rinpoche. Rinpoche laughed and didn't mind. After all, not everything from the other world was useful. How's your training going? Rinpoche asked curiously. He wanted to know about the progress of the basic martial arts manual. The time is too short and we haven't seen much progress, Yang Sun said simply. There was nothing to hide about this. Rinpoche nodded. It seemed that the content of the early stage was basically like this. He had to at least reach the man-will level and transform his blood and chi into essence before he could get what he wanted. What's worth noting is the hurdle of transforming blood and chi into essence. Many people are stuck at this threshold, Rinpoche reminded them. We also noticed this problem. Although each of the books was vague, we also discovered this point after verifying it with the 4 books. Why don't you explain to us what we need to pay attention to and what are the key points of each stage? Yang Sun suggested. Rinpoche spread his hands and said, I can't help you with this. My martial arts manual is different from these and I don't know much about them. Yang Sun's eyes lit up. He understood something from Rinpoche's words. In other words, there are many types of cultivation methods? Rinpoche thought for a moment, nodded his head and said, You can say that. However, there are some that require a specific group of people to cultivate. What I brought over is the most suitable for you. The aboriginals were different from Great Xia's. Rinpoche's Rui visualization was also different from Great Xia's. If it wasn't like this, he wouldn't be able to cultivate it. Yang Sen nodded his head and didn't mention anything about providing them with martial arts manuals for reference. After all, these 4 martial arts manuals were already invaluable to Earth. If they were too greedy, it would be easy to make the other party feel disgusted, especially since they hadn't found anything that the other party needed. The other party wasn't someone who would selflessly contribute in the name of righteousness. They could only find an opportunity to make a request when the cooperation between the two parties improved. Rinpoche left the laboratory. Before returning to Shiqing, he asked Shen Feng to prepare the information on how to boil black brine into salt. Since he already knew the composition of the black brine, he was relieved. There weren't any twists and turns that he had expected. It was solved very easily. Although he was a little disappointed, he had to admit that this was the best outcome. Previously he had already looked up some information. Even if only black brine was used, salt could be produced. However, it would take a little more time. After a long period of boiling, the substances with sulfuric acid in the water could be turned into monomer crystals. Then these substances could be dissolved in the water by splashing water. As salt dissolves slower in water, it would be left behind. Rinpoche could imagine how big of a sensation this news would cause when it reached the imperial court. No matter how much manpower and material resources they had to use, Dayo wouldn't let go of this opportunity. They would have complete control over the salt in their hands. He could also go back and prepare the historical records that said, the great pioneer, scientist and educator Rinpoche led 24 idle disciples to research the production method of well salt on Nine Peaks Mountain. This solved the problem of salt shortage since the founding of Dayo. His only regret was that the solution was too simple. There were no twists and turns. Even when he wrote it, it was plain and not attractive enough. It didn't show the soul-stirring and touching feeling that he had finally obtained the method of making salt after going through 81 difficulties. Think about it. The 7 Calabash brothers went through untold hardships to head to the castle, defeat Snow White and her 7 saint warriors, and rescue the little match girl. This experience was enough to write a soul-stirring novel. The other story was about the Lich King slapping the little match girl and Snow White to death in the castle and capturing the 7 dwarfs to lead a shameless life. Which one was more attractive? Therefore. Chapter 338. Wang Dachui was walking on a dirt road. The sun was setting, reminding him of his youth that had passed away. Beside it was a stone tablet with the words Jinyang Ridge written on it. Not far ahead was a wine tavern. The scene changed to Wang Dachui entering the tavern. He slammed the table and shouted, "Waiter, serve the wine." Finishing the bowl, Wang Dachui slammed the table again. "Waiter, serve the wine and a plate of kimchi." After finishing the 3rd bowl, when Wang Dachui asked for wine again, the boy whispered, "Sir, our wine has a strong kick. It said that 3 bowls won't be enough. Cut the crap and serve the alcohol. I have blue bottles." Wang Dachui slammed the table confidently. A moment later, Wang Dachui, who had drunk 18 bowls of wine, walked to a secluded place. At this moment, there was a tiger's roar, like a whirlwind sweeping away the clouds, and a huge bug appeared in front of Wang Dachui. Wang Dachui was stunned for a moment. Then he took out a mana potion and poured it into his mouth. His eyes immediately cleared and he turned around to run. His legs were like fans. After drinking alcohol, I still need to drink mana potions. Rinpoche sat on the sofa and grinned. Today was the first day of the Blue Vase commercial. He specially watched it and it left a deep impression on him. It was especially so for Wang Dachui's face. Many young people would want to laugh when they saw him. After watching the advertisement, he switched off the television and picked up the cloak that he had gotten previously from the place where he had custom-made clothes for the Empress. Then he took the Empress's snacks, a box of glassware used for chemical experiments, and some other materials back to Dayo. There was also a cloth bag of salt that weighed about 20 caddies. Some of it was Nagu's commission, and some was for the Stockade Village. It was enough for the Stockade Village to use for half a month. As soon as he returned to Dayo, Rinpoche felt that he had stepped on something that gave him a fright. Rinpoche's reaction was even greater than Rinpoche's. He flipped over and sent Rinpoche crashing into the wall. The things in his hands fell to the ground. "Were you trying to scare?" Rinpoche felt pain all over his body. If he wasn't a man-wheel expert now, he would most likely be lying on the ground today. And the initiator of all this was Lin Xiaola, who was now bristling with anger after being stepped on by him. "You stepped on me?" At this moment Lin Xiaola was completely awake. Her face was full of grief and indignation. Just now, when she was stepped on, all the hair on her body stood up. If she had a tail, it would probably explode like a mace. What are you doing in such a big house? Just now Rinpoche heard a bunch of crashing sounds. At this moment, when he lowered his head to take a look, those glassware were indeed broken into pieces like tofu dregs. Why can't I stay in such a big house? Lin Xiaola also glared at him with a threatening look on her face. She was just short of baring her canine teeth. Rinpoche, do you know how valuable these are? Rinpoche pointed at the pile of glass shards in the box at his feet with a face full of resentment. You stepped on me. Lin Xiaola also heard the sound of glass shattering. She felt that she might be in trouble. She lay down, closed her eyes and went to sleep. His arms, ears and head were all covered. Rinpoche didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he saw her expression. Hiding your head? Do you think you're an ostrich? It's a pity. I was planning to demonstrate a chemistry experiment to the students. Now I'm dead before I even started. Rinpoche didn't care about the box anymore. He went to the side and switched on the radio station. He wanted to hear if anything had happened during the day that he was away. Wars in ancient times were not like those in modern times, where a battle could be fought all the way to the capital of another country within a few days. It had been 10 days since the start of the war, and the reinforcements were still some distance away from the front line. The Empress would also need a few more days to reach the front line. Time was wasted on the road. However, this wasn't too bad for the Aboriginals, who had suffered a huge loss at the start of the battle and were familiarizing themselves with the new communication tool. This was because the other party had also wasted a lot of time on the road. Your Majesty, are you there? Rinpoche asked after listening for a while and waiting for no one to speak. What is it? The Empress seemed to be peeping at the screen all along, but she didn't say anything. After a few seconds, Rinpoche responded indifferently. So your Majesty is here. This humble subject greets your Majesty. Someone immediately said. Your Majesty, +1 Your Majesty, +2 Rinpoche. Why don't you people have any eyesight? If you have something to say, then say it. If not, you may leave, the Empress said faintly. Finally the channel was quiet. It's cold in the north and your Majesty should wear more. I have prepared a cloak for you and I will send it to you by express delivery tomorrow, Rinpoche said with a smile. The Empress was speechless. How's the situation at your place? The Empress asked. There shouldn't be any problems. I will go to another place to take a look over the next 2 days. After that I can start to design a plan to produce salt, Rinpoche said. Rinpoche said. Nowadays the Empress was the only person in this world who could share his joy with him. That's good. The Empress's voice was filled with joy. No matter which country, salt and iron were extremely important. However, in Dayo these two areas were considered weak. Now that the iron problem had been solved, there was hope for salt. How could the Empress not be happy? The two of them chatted for a while before Rinpoche took his leave and switched off the radio. He turned around and saw Lin Xiaola looking at him pitifully with her big eyes. She was holding her stomach with both hands. I can't help you with this matter. You can go out and drink some hot water, Rinpoche said. I can't even fill my stomach with water. Lin Xiaola complained. Are you hungry? Rinpoche was enlightened. What do you think? Lin Xiaola asked faintly. When Rinpoche went out to ask the guards to prepare some food for Lin Xiaola, he found out that Lin Xiaola basically didn't leave the house for the whole day and night. Even the food was sent to the door by someone else. She should have been waiting for him to return. This simple-minded girl. Rinpoche sighed. The next day Rinpoche asked a guard to send the cloak and snacks down the mountain. Then he set off for the mountains again. This time he was going to walk for the whole day and spend the night outside. Many students were excited. When no one was paying attention, Tong Lan slipped to Rinpoche's side and said faintly, Yesterday you stayed in the room with Sister Lin for the whole day. A man and a woman alone like firewood and fire. How are you going to explain this to Her Majesty? Rinpoche spat out a mouthful of blood. The metal chain stretched out from the top of Rinpoche's head like an antenna, perfectly straight. Where did you learn this from? Rinpoche looked embarrassed. Every time Dad goes to the brothel to drink, Grandpa says the same thing, Tong Lan continued faintly. Rinpoche was shocked. Tong Jinye, you old B*****, you still have the cheek to say that about others with a series of battles at the top of the brothel? Tong Lan, your father was actually adopted, right? Ah woo. Lin Xiaola, who was sleepy, yawned and asked, Why do I have to explain? In any case, it's nothing good. Every time, Dad gets beaten up by Mom, Tonglan said with a look of disdain. Chapter 339. They walked on the mountain for a day and killed countless small animals, which became their lunch at noon. Finally, they arrived at the mountain stream with a light brown stream in the evening. The stream gushed out from under a rock and flowed down for about 100 meters before flowing into a crack in the ground. With the test results from the black pool, Rinpoche was more confident this time. This must be the other kind of brine that he had found. Rinpoche continued to dip his finger in the water and licked it. Although it was poisonous, this amount wasn't harmful. Similarly, it was salty and bitter. It tasted even worse than the black pool, causing him to shudder. Then, he delightedly dipped his index finger in the water and licked his middle finger. Not bad, it's a little sweet. Rinpoche nodded. How is that possible? Nagu didn't believe it and wanted to try it. However, there were people who acted much faster than her. A few students copied Rinpoche's actions and dipped their fingers in the water to lick them. Their faces twitched like dried orange peels. Liar. Tonglan pointed at Rinpoche and accused him. Don't you think it's sweet? Rinpoche was surprised. Does this water taste different in different people? As soon as he said this, the other students also tried it. Then their faces twitched. Pairs of hateful eyes were cast on Rinpoche. Science is like this. No matter what others say, it can't compare to trying it yourself. Not only do you have to try it, but you also have to think about why. Rinpoche put on a kind face and guided them patiently. You are obviously lying to us to try it, Tonglan said disdainfully. Her eyes kept looking around to see if there were any wild fruits. Then her eyes lit up. She jumped 7 or 8 meters away and plucked a bunch of wild fruits that were as big as red cherries. Then she proudly put it into her mouth. You will know my painstaking efforts in the future. As Rinpoche spoke, he threw a piece of white rabbit creamy candy into his mouth. The expression on his face immediately relaxed. Get some water, Rinpoche said. This time around he took more than 20 bottles. If this brine was as he thought, he had to test the ratio of it with the black brine. There was no harm in bringing more. After all, it was a bit further away from here. After the guard filled the bottle with water, he looked at the sky and asked Nagu, is there a place nearby where we can spend the night? The shortest way is half a day's journey. We wasted too much time on our way here, Nagu said. Then let's see if there's a suitable place around here. Come back in an hour and hunt some prey along the way, Rinpoche said to the guards. Most of the guards immediately dispersed, and some of the students followed suit. Can the black pool in this place really produce edible salt? Nagu asked after the guard left. It should be possible. Rinpoche didn't sound too confident. So your village might not need to hunt in the future. If we don't hunt, what are we going to eat? Nagu felt that Rinpoche was talking nonsense. Even if they could get their hands on salt, they wouldn't be able to eat it. In the future, there will be a salt factory in this mountain that belongs to the Ministry of Works and the royal family. You can choose to work in the salt factory. That way you won't need to hunt so hard. Of course, you can also continue to hunt, but I'm afraid you will have to travel very far. With so many people, the prey will definitely be scared away. Alternatively, you can apply for compensation and move your village to another place. Oh. Nagu nodded. Rinpoche looked at her and thought that she would have a bigger reaction. After all, their village had always been here. Will there be salt to eat in the future? Nagu asked. She seemed to be more concerned about this issue. After all, in her opinion, there were countless prey in the mountains. Even if they couldn't hunt it today or tomorrow, they would be able to hunt it the day after. They wouldn't starve to death. She didn't think that the development of a salt factory would affect the village. However, she knew that there would be no strength without salt. Yes. Rinpoche nodded. If there wasn't enough salt here, then they would hunt to the coast of the Yun nation. There would definitely be salt there. That's good. Nagu said happily. Sir, can salt really be produced here? The two officials from the Ministry of Works asked loudly with faces full of disbelief. It was only now that they realized why Rinpoche had brought everyone to the mountains. Rinpoche took a closer look at the two of them and recalled their identities. Their presence was too low, and he had almost forgotten about them these few days. Yes. Rinpoche nodded. However, we still have to go back and study the specifics. Great, this is great. The two of them said repeatedly. Salt was a knot in everyone's heart. For so many years, there had been no solution, and it had always been in the hands of the merchants from the other three nations. Now that they could actually produce salt here, the two of them were really excited. After a while all the guards returned. One of them found a suitable place. It was a corner between two mountain walls, and they only needed to pay attention to the beasts on the other two sides at night. There was also a protruding rock above that could shelter them in case it rained at night. Rinpoche brought everyone to have a look. It was already good enough that they could find such a place in such a short time. Next, everyone dispersed to look for prey. The animals in this area were considered unlucky. Even if they went into a hole, they would be caught by a few students. When the sky turned dark, everyone returned. They had caught a dozen small animals that looked like deer and were called dwarves. More than 40 fat animals that looked like mountain rats were strung together. There were also 2 pythons, a flower bear, and a number of wild fruits. Rinpoche saw the innocent panda that died unjustly and went up to give it a kick. "Sir, although this thing is a little unpalatable, we can't find much to eat in such a short time," the guard said with a face full of grievance. He had an expression that said, "Sir, just make do with it." Furthermore, there were so many other prey. Even if this thing was unpalatable, it wasn't for you to eat. Forget it, hurry up and deal with it. Leave the bear paw for me. Rinpoche stared for a long time and finally sighed. The panda was a national treasure on Earth, but in this place, it was an animal that didn't taste good and could be found everywhere. Other than acting dumb, it didn't know how to do anything else. Of course, its attack power wasn't weak and was similar to that of a bear. Next, he found a place near the mountain wall to rest and watched as the guards started a fire. The other guards and some of the students brought the prey to a nearby water source to deal with it. 2 hours later, Rinpoche used 2 wooden sticks to hold 4 bear paws and flipped them over the fire. The aroma of the barbecued meat and seasoning drifted out. However, it wasn't just the bear paws in his hands. The other meat that was being roasted over the fire was also emitting a similar aroma. Rinpoche waited for the bear paw to cool down a little before taking a bite. The taste was average and not very fatty. It was even worse than pig's trotters. He immediately lost the desire to continue eating. He threw the bear paws to someone else and took 2 dwarf beast legs to gnaw on. The taste was much better. As the moon rose higher and higher, the howls of wild beasts could be heard from afar. Occasionally, the sound of animals running in the forest could be heard. Everyone wasn't worried about wild beasts attacking them. If they really came over, they would have a midnight snack. Unfortunately, they didn't get a midnight snack. Instead, they got a downpour. The weather in the mountains changed abruptly. From the moment the first drop of rain fell on their faces, the rain continued to pour. In less than a minute, more than half of the fire had been extinguished. Everyone shrank under that huge rock. "Look after the top, don't fall," Rinpoche exhorted again and again. He was afraid that if the soil loosened, the huge rock would smash him into a meat patty. "Don't worry, sir." Sherhu turned his head. His face was drenched in rainwater. Many guards stood outside, shielding Rinpoche and the students from the wind and rain. It rained for 4 hours. The guards outside were almost completely drenched. Early the next morning, Rinpoche and the rest ate some wild fruits to fill their stomachs before setting off on their way back. It rained last night and the mountain path was much more difficult to walk, especially since the leaves were covered in water. By noon, everyone's bodies were wet and dry. It wasn't until night time that everyone returned to the stronghold with their stomachs rumbling. They had almost wiped out the remaining rations in the stronghold. The hunting team that had gone out had yet to return after 2 days. If they didn't return tomorrow, everyone would probably starve. After resting for a night, Rinpoche drove most of the guards out to hunt the next morning. All the students went to the riverside to fish with their fingers. As for himself, he basked in the sun in the stronghold. At night, the guards who had been driven out to hunt returned with game. The 2 hunting teams also returned with game shortly after. Finally, everyone didn't have to go hungry. At night, Rinpoche brought the 2 types of brine back to Earth and got the laboratory to test and find out the ratio. By the time he returned to Dayo, he was completely at ease. There were no longer any problems with salt production. Just as he turned on the radio, he heard the furious voice of the Empress. "Li Qinxiu, how many more days before you arrive at Yuxing City? Your Majesty, my vanguard will arrive tomorrow. Wait for the entire army to arrive before attacking and killing them all," the Empress said coldly. "Yes," Li Qinxiu replied in a deep voice. Rinpoche's heart skipped a beat. Did something happen to Yuxing City? Could it be that the city had been breached? How could it be so fast? Dayo was really ferocious. After listening for a while, he finally understood that Yuxing City had indeed been breached. Furthermore, a great Xia sect had dug a tunnel directly into the city. Afterward, a large number of practitioners from the Great Xia sects entered the city through the tunnel and set fire everywhere. Outside, there were 100,000 Great Xia soldiers attacking ferociously. In just half a day the city was breached. Less than 300 of the 2,500 soldiers had retreated, and 5,000 of the 40,000 civilians had died in battle. Yes, they had died in battle. The ordinary civilians of Dayo also had considerable fighting strength. However, it was still difficult for untrained civilians to affect the overall situation when faced with 100,000 Great Xia soldiers and numerous experts from the Great Xia sections. In this battle, the Great Xia army suffered more than 10,000 casualties, while Dayo's losses were more than 2,000 soldiers and 5,000 civilians. The ratio of casualties between both sides had reached 2-to-1, which was already terrifying for Dayo. One had to know that Great Xia currently had more than 500,000 soldiers at the front line, and there were still 200,000 soldiers in Great Xia ready to set off. The entire military strength of Dayo, including the new recruits who were still in training, was only 110,000. The current confrontation with Great Xia consisted of 30,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the North, 8,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center, and 1,200 winged cavalry warriors led by the Empress. There were only 50,000 soldiers. So far, after the two battles at Ziyue City and Yuxing City, the Dayo army had already lost more than 6,000 soldiers, while the Great Xia army had lost less than 70,000 soldiers. Among them, the Great Xia sects had played a huge role. Chapter 340. 2 days later, Tong Jingye rushed to Nine Peaks Mountain. Upon seeing Ren Baqin, he picked him up and shook him like a little chick. "Sir Ren, is what you said true? Can salt really be produced?" Tong Jingye's boorish face was filled with excitement and nervousness. He was afraid that Ren Baqin would say no. "Put me down first," Ren Baqin shouted. Tong Jingye's claws were like iron pincers, and he was almost seeing stars from the shaking. Tong Jingye loosened his grip. Ren Baqin fell to the ground and almost fell. What hatred! Ren Baqin looked resentful. He almost fell apart from the shaking just now. "Sir Ren, is what you said true?" Tong Jingye asked anxiously. "Why would I lie to you?" Ren Baqin rubbed his shoulders. Previously, when Ren Baqin said that salt could be produced here, the Dayo official chat group immediately went silent. Following which, voices of surprise and disbelief could be heard. After hearing the news, Tong Jingye rushed to the Shi residence and asked about the situation before rushing over. "Is there salt?" Tong Jingye asked. "I'll wait for you to come," Ren Baqin replied. "Don't worry, I'm at least 80% sure." "For such a big matter, you must be 100% sure," Tong Jingye said in a deep voice. "It's useless to say so much. We'll know once we try. Have you brought the things you want?" "Yes." Tong Jingye asked someone to bring in 2 large buckets filled with milk. However, due to the weather in Dayo, the milk had already gone bad. In addition, there were large pots, sieves, and coarse cloth. Ren Baqin also asked someone to bring out a few large buckets of brine. These were the brine that he had asked people to bring back from 2 different places. "Come and help," Ren Baqin called out to the students. Immediately, a few students ran out. At this moment, the empty space in the middle of the village was surrounded by students, guards, and officials from the Ministry of Works. On the contrary, the aboriginals in the village were pushed outside. Most of them still didn't know what was going on. They only heard from Nagu that they were going to use the 2 types of poisonous water to produce salt, but most of them didn't believe her. The water was indeed salty, but it could also poison people to death. Now, it seemed that another high-ranking official from the imperial court had arrived. "Record the process," Ren Baqin reminded. Then he got someone to pour the black brine and yellow brine into a basin according to a certain ratio. Very quickly, small pieces of white crystals appeared at the bottom of the basin. When the sulfate in the black brine and the barium in the yellow brine come together, they will form barium sulfate that is insoluble in water, Ren Baqin said to the student beside him. Although they hadn't learned these things yet, it was still a rare experimental experience. After asking someone to filter out the white crystals, Ren Baqin said to Tong Jingye, "Keep this barium sulfate and store it as it can be used elsewhere in the future." After that, it was time to fry the salt. Ren Baqin got someone to start a fire and boil the brine before pouring a portion of the buffalo milk into it. Logically speaking, it would be more reasonable to use soybean milk. However, soybeans were only grown in the southern part of Great Xia, and they were called soybeans. Dayo, on the other hand, had none. After asking around on Earth, he found out that he could use dairy products instead. It was very expensive, but salt was even more expensive in Dayo. The proteins in the milk can precipitate the high-velocity ions in the brine and can absorb the residues. Ren Bachien continued. Although the surrounding students were listening, they didn't understand at all. Proteins, high-velocity ions, barium sulfate, and so on were completely incomprehensible. This was the case for the students, and it was even more so for Tong Xinye and the other people from the Ministry of Works. However, they still tried their best to record the process. Before the effects of frying the salt could be seen, the smell of milk from the pot assailed their nostrils, causing many people to feel hungry. Did you bring rations? There isn't enough food in the stronghold for so many people, Rinpoche reminded. Tong Xinye had brought a few dozen people with him when he came. Now there were more than 100 extra mouths in the stronghold, and they were all strong and had huge appetites. One had to know that the more powerful the aboriginals were, the bigger their appetites were. Although the hunting team had brought back some prey and the guards had caught some small beasts, the food in the stronghold wasn't enough for so many people. Tong Xinye glanced at Rinpoche. He didn't need to remind Rinpoche, as Tong Xinye knew the situation of the strongholds in the mountains better than him. After that, everyone ate while waiting. There was a large group of people in the middle of the stronghold, but they were now sitting on the ground instead of standing. The aboriginals were watching from a distance. During the frying process, they had to use a strainer made of coarse cloth to scoop out the impurities from the water from time to time. This went on for 8 hours before they stopped adding water to the pot. The water in the pot gradually evaporated, and a layer of white crystals began to appear on the wall of the pot. Is this the salt that is made? Tong Xinye, who had been watching from the side for 8 hours, was shocked. Not only him but the others were also shocked. One had to know that even though there were only a few people and 2 pots, what they were doing affected tens of millions of people in Dayo. It's still lacking a little, Rinpoche said. After a while, when the water had completely evaporated, he got someone to scoop out all the white crystals from the pot, shake them on a dense bamboo sieve, and then pour some water over them. Most of the salt didn't dissolve with the water, and the remaining impurities almost dissolved in the water and flowed down. Is it done now? Tong Xinye looked at the remaining layer of white crystals on the bamboo sieve. His eyes lit up as if he wanted to pounce on it and lick it. Rinpoche dipped his finger into the salt and put it in his mouth. Then he nodded and said, "Let's dry it." Without saying anything, Tong Xinye dipped his finger into the salt and put it in the water. Then he burst into wild laughter and said, "Dayo finally doesn't have to suffer from a lack of salt." Not only him but the students also cheered. Dayo had suffered from a lack of salt for decades. Back then, it was because the salt was poisoned that they were attacked from the mountains and destroyed the entire Hao nation. Even so, Dayo still didn't have salt. For so many years, both the people at the foot of the mountain and the aboriginals had suffered from a lack of salt. After so many years, salt had long become one of the most important resources in the hearts of the people of Dayo. It was difficult for outsiders to understand the importance and desire of the people of Dayo for salt. Although they didn't do anything other than fishing this time, they were able to witness the production of salt from the brine with their own eyes. They could also understand the significance of this to Dayo. It was like a poverty-stricken person suddenly discovering a mountain of gold. Furthermore, Rinpoche was the principal of the academy. The more impressive Rinpoche was, the more it proved that their choice was correct and that they could learn more things from him. When the aboriginals saw the people in the middle of the stronghold cheering crazily, they also became restless. This was because they had heard what Tong Xinye said just now. However, they still had doubts in their hearts. Was this salt edible? One had to know that the water in the black pool could poison people to death. Rinpoche looked at them cheering and a smile appeared on his face. In any case, he had accomplished something again. However, he didn't have to laugh for long before he couldn't. Shurgan, Du Laolu and the others grabbed his hands and feet and threw him up. Rinpoche's eyes widened. I can understand that you guys are happy and you guys are throwing people to celebrate. However, who has ever seen someone being thrown up 4 or 5 stories high? Rinpoche felt as if he was sitting on a dirt plane. He was thrown more than 10 meters high and let out a series of screams. F***ck, I'm afraid of heights. Whoever throws it at me again, I'll shoot him. Chapter 341. When everyone started to calm down, Rinpoche tidied up his robe and said to Tong Xinye, although we can produce salt, there is still a problem that we need to pay attention to. What problem? Tong Xinye was startled. He had just received good news and was afraid that Rinpoche would say bad news. The distance between the two outlets is a small problem. Although it consumes a lot of manpower, Dayo can afford it. Rinpoche pondered for a while and said, Dayo has a population of 30 million. Even if one person consumes 1 kilogram of salt a year, 1,000 people will consume 1 ton, and 10 million people will consume 10,000 tons. This amount is too large, Rinpoche said. This was calculated based on the fact that the average intake of salt in Dayo was much less than the average person on Earth. The normal intake should be double what Rinpoche said. Rinpoche calculated in his heart. The pot of brine just now should have produced 1.5 kilograms of salt, and the proportion of salt produced was about 4%. This meant that 100 kilograms of brine could produce 4 kilograms of salt. With the strength of the Dayo people, they could at most carry 200 kilograms of brine on the mountain roads, which produced 8 kilograms of salt. Not to mention the problem of containers, it would take 2 days to go to the yellow brine and back. Even if the place where the salt was boiled was placed between the black brine and the yellow brine, it would still take a day and a half. It was the same for the black brine. Including the rest time, it was equivalent to one person bringing back 4 kilograms of brine in 2 days. 1 ton of salt could be produced 180 times a year, regardless of rain or shine. In that case, at least 10,000 people would be needed to transport the brine. In addition to boiling and drying the salt, at least 11,000 people would be needed. However, in reality 20,000 people would be needed. After all, transporting the brine was actually hard work. In addition to those who made the containers, transported the water buffalo milk, and transported the ingredients, a total of more than 20,000 people would be needed. This was calculated based on the minimum consumption of 1 kilogram of salt a year. If Dayo's salt production was sufficient to meet its daily needs, it would require even more manpower. At least 10,000 more people would be needed. Of course, this price was acceptable for Dayo to pay for salt production. The problem lay in another point. The main problem is that the amount of brine can't keep up with such a large consumption, Rinpoche said after some thought. The Blackwater pool is still all right. I've paid attention to the place where the yellow brine comes out. There should only be 20 to 30 tons of water flowing out in a day. That's too little salt production. The flow rate of 20 to 30 tons was far from Rinpoche's requirements. Even with a considerable amount of black brine mixed in, only about 2 tons of salt could be produced. 700 tons of salt a year was too little, not even 1/10 of the total consumption. At first, Rinpoche thought of expanding the area, but later on he felt that this wasn't a good idea. Because the water flow was small and not rapid, it meant that it wasn't just the problem of the exit, but the distance from the underground to the exit wasn't long. Does Sir Rin have an idea? Tong Jinya asked. There's one thing. Well, drilling. Since black brine and yellow brine can be produced, it means that there is more than one sealed underground seawater lake. If we dig a well in a suitable place, we can bring the spring closer, save manpower and resources, and also solve the problem of insufficient brine. That's easy. Tong Jinya chuckled. If it was any other problem he would be worried, but digging a well was not a difficult task. What if it's a few hundred meters or 1,000 meters deep? Rinpoche asked faintly. Furthermore, it wasn't just a well. The location of the seawater lake was too deep, and it was difficult to determine its location. At present, all they knew was that there was an 80% chance that they could reach it by drilling in the vicinity of 2 springs. However, the distance was too far, and it was difficult to meet Rinpoche's requirements. Rinpoche didn't believe that there weren't seawater lakes in other parts of this mountain. In the long run, drilling a well was more suitable. However, this wasn't something that could be done overnight. One had to know that in ancient times on Earth, it would take a year or even a few years to drill a well. The Aboriginals were strong, but they wouldn't be of much help in this matter. Let's build the salt boiling plant first. If there isn't enough yellow brine, we can use another method that only uses black brine to boil salt, even though it's slower. I just hope that the black pool can last a little longer. Rinpoche thought for a long time and felt somewhat helpless. This was a problem that he had raised, but it wasn't something that could be solved overnight. Even if they were to dig wells at multiple locations at the same time, they might be lucky enough to find 1 or 2 that could be used. However, it would take at least a year. That night, Rinpoche made another trip to Earth. When he came back, he brought along something that looked rather strange. It was completely black, had a thin tube at the front, and was slightly longer than Rinpoche. In addition, there were a few heavy boxes. What's this? Lin Xiaola was a little curious. Just a little preparation. In a few days I will teach Great Xia how to behave, Rinpoche said confidently. At the same time, he despised that bunch of stingy people. It took a lot of effort to obtain a heavy machine gun and ammunition. Even though the matter of the salt pan hadn't been completely resolved, he was already making preparations to look for the Empress. This was the Type 8512, 7mm anti-aircraft machine gun that he had just obtained from the nation. It was 15 meters long, weighed nearly 19 kilograms and weighed 18 kilograms. It had a theoretical firing rate of 650 to 700 rounds per minute and an effective range of 1,600 meters. Within this range, it could split a person into two. Rinpoche was a little excited at the thought of bringing this thing to the battlefield. At that time, he would definitely get someone to take a photo of his heroic appearance and leave it for future generations. He would be the legendary Rambo Ren. For the next 2 days, Rinpoche accompanied Tong Jinye to the Black Pool and the Yellow Brine Spring. He also found a location that he felt was more suitable to build a salt pan. At least, this location didn't require too many detours. Furthermore, after cutting down the weeds and trees along the way, it was easier to carry the container and walk. At the same time, he also selected 7 or 8 locations to prepare for drilling wells. According to Rinpoche, he had a unique technique for selecting locations. In any case, other people would have to rely on blind guesses, so he might as well do it himself. What if he guessed correctly? Every night, he would explain to the people from the Ministry of Works about the design drawings of stop drilling. Stop drilling completely relied on people to step on the pedal and use the principle of leverage to drill. It was slightly more advanced than a single-cylinder well and was already the best method in this world that didn't use modern machinery. Your Majesty, Dayo's letter has been sent back. In the palace of Great Xia, an old man sat on a high chair with 2 rows of civil and military officials standing below. Read it. The old man revealed a smile on his face. At present, 500,000 soldiers had already entered Dayo's territory and opened up a path. 200,000 reinforcements had already arrived at the border, and 300,000 new soldiers were still training in Great Xia's territory. His goal was to conquer Dayo with an army of 1 million soldiers. At present, the development of the war had also reached his initial expectations. After opening the door, Dayo was already like a young girl that could be manipulated by anyone. However, Dayo's letter should have been sent before the war started. He didn't know what that little girl from Dayo wanted to say and how she would explain it. Although no matter what she said, it was impossible to make Great Xia retreat. Listening to her explanation and combining it with the current progress of the war, it was still quite amusing. Xia Jingdi and Xia Jiolong were sitting on high chairs, feeling very satisfied. Chapter 342. Xia Bailong looked at the eunuch beside him and didn't speak for a long time. Then he softly uttered, causing the eunuch to shudder. Your Majesty, please forgive me. This handwriting is really hard to read. The eunuch immediately knelt on the ground. Get up. It's not easy for a bunch of barbarians to be able to write. Xia Bailong laughed. As though he had pressed a switch, the ministers below also burst into laughter. Their smiles were filled with contempt. Your Majesty is right. It's already not easy for those barbarians to be able to write. We can't ask for more, a minister echoed. Xia Bailong nodded in satisfaction. Your Majesty, I'm old and have poor eyesight. I really can't recognize the handwriting, the eunuch said carefully after reading the letter. Even though Rinpoche found it hard to recognize himself, it wasn't to the point where he couldn't recognize him at all. However, as someone who had been serving Xia Bailong for a long time, he understood his temperament very well. If he really read this letter, he would definitely not be able to get anything out of it. Even if he was fine in the short term, after a period of time, he would find an excuse to die without a burial ground. Eunuchs like them relied on the emperor's favor. If the emperor was dissatisfied with them, countless people would want to step on their bones to climb to the top. You can't even read a letter properly. Get lost, Xia Bailong snorted coldly. Li Kairue, you read it. Yes. A spirited old man with grizzled hair and beard took the letter and read it in detail. A strange expression appeared on his face. What? You can't even recognize him, Grand Secretary? Xia Jiolong sneered. Li Kairue was the tutor of the Great Xia dynasty as well as the Grand Secretary of the Zhaoyang Dojo. Naturally, he would not be like the eunuch just now. He just smiled bitterly and said, the words in this letter are somewhat disrespectful to His Majesty. But Xia Bailong coldly said, I would like to hear how disrespectful you are. Li Kairue laughed bitterly in his heart, then cleared his throat and said, the Empress of Dayo to His Majesty of Great Xia, My old friend was as arrogant as you, and now the grass on his grave is 5 feet high. Looking at the grass on my grave, I think of my old friend. An old friend is like a ruler, his grave is like grass on his eyebrows. The first sentence was changed from the original Xia Baichong. After all, these words were too unpleasant to hear. However, the rest of the content was told truthfully. When Li Kairui was halfway through reading, the smile on Xia Bailong's face froze. By the time Li Kairui finished reciting, Xia Baichong's entire body was emitting a cold aura, and the armrest of his chair, which was made of pure gold, had a deep fingerprint on it. Everyone below was dumbfounded. No one expected Dayo's letter to contain such content. It was simply a direct insult. Old friend like you. 5 feet of grass on his grave? What kind of words were those? Still thinking of old friends like you? An old friend like a ruler with grass on his brow at his grave? This was simply a hooligan cursing in the street. Originally, everyone wanted to ridicule the Empress of Dayo and tried their best to explain. However, they still wanted to beat her up. But at this moment, no one could say anything. The Empress of Dayo had no intention of explaining at all. He immediately started scolding. Although Rinpoche had previously thought about the reaction of the Empress of Dayo, a normal person would at least explain a little, right? Even if he brushed it off and said that he didn't know about the 7th prince's death, he would still be able to save face. How could this be? How could the prideful Xia Bailong accept this? How could these people, who had always regarded themselves as the strongest nation, accept this? Everyone felt that no matter what the Empress said, they would still beat her up, and that she was already a hooligan. They didn't expect her to be as strong as them. She started with a limerick and started scolding right away. Qi Zixiao actually dared to do this? Xia Bailong's chest heaved up and down heavily as he cursed. I must capture her and bring her back to Jiujiang. Let's see if she can still be so stubborn. Please calm down, Your Majesty. She was just venting her words, Li Kairui said in a deep voice. I know, but she actually dared to humiliate me like this. Xia Bailong was furious. After that day, Xia Bailong had a headache and it was difficult for him to sleep at night for many days in a row. If he knew that his impulsive letter had caused the Empress of Great Xia's blood pressure to rise to the point of having a cerebral hemorrhage, he would probably be so proud that he would immediately write about it in his so-called records of the Grand Historian. Apart from discussing with Tong Xinye and the others about the location of the salt works, the manufacturing process, and the drilling of the wells, he would also learn about the situation at the front line from the radio. After Yuxing City was breached, the army of the Protectorate of the Center finally arrived at the front line. Previously, 1,000 soldiers were sent to Yuxing City to assist in the defense, but all of them perished after the fall of the city. The remaining 7,000 soldiers and Yuxing City didn't fight with the Great Xia army. The other party was guarding the city, and it was difficult for the 7,000 soldiers of Dayo to attack. If they were to forcefully attack, not only would they fail but they would also suffer a lot of casualties. As a result, they attacked the 70,000 Great Xia soldiers outside Gyuk City one day later. Together with the remaining 1,000 soldiers inside the city, they killed half of the 80,000 Great Xia soldiers, leaving behind at least 20,000 corpses. More than 10,000 Great Xia soldiers were scattered outside, and only half of them retreated to Liao City to join the 80,000 Great Xia soldiers there. At this time, there were still 5,000 soldiers left in the Protectorate of the Center. At this time, the Empress was approaching Liao City and was using the radio to communicate with Li Qianqiu from time to time. She was preparing to attack the 120,000 Great Xia soldiers in Liao City. Only the aboriginals could use 6,000 people to fight against an army of 120,000. Rinpoche found it hard to accept that 1,200 of the 6,000 winged cavalry warriors were at least at the earthwheel level. After all, the education on Earth was about hundreds of thousands of soldiers surrounding hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers, and they had received this education for more than 20 years. Now, a few thousand soldiers were fighting against hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers. Even though he knew that the strength of an earthwheel expert wasn't comparable to that of an ordinary army, this number still made him feel uncomfortable. Rinpoche sat on the ground with a drill model in front of him. He gently tapped his finger on a small piece of wood behind the model, and the drill bit drilled into the ground with the help of a lever. It didn't take long for a small hole to be drilled. The surrounding students looked curiously at the model that Rinpoche was fiddling with. Although they had learned a little physics, it was all theoretical and they only talked about optical fibers. This was the second time they saw a mechanical model that could be used in real life. As such, they were very curious and carefully observed it. This was what they wanted to learn in the future. The first time they saw Rinpoche's motorcycle, which had been successfully turned into a pile of scrap metal. After fiddling with the model for a long time, Rinpoche retracted his hand and said to Tong Jingye, "This is basically what happened. The rest is up to you guys." "Sir Rin isn't staying here?" Tong Jingye was slightly stunned. "It's about time. I'm going to the front line to take a look," Rinpoche said casually with the aura of an expert who looked down on his enemies. Those who weren't familiar with him wouldn't be able to tell that he was acting cool. "Sir Rin, it's better for you to stay here so that everyone can be less worried," Tong Jingye said with a strange look on his face. Previously he had been assassinated twice and each time Her Majesty flew into a rage. Now he still wanted to go to the front line? Should he say that he was magnanimous or that he didn't know what was good for him? "As long as you stay here peacefully and don't get into any trouble, that will be the greatest contribution you can make." Rinpoche stared at him and said, "Do you really think I'm made of clay? I don't even have the ability to protect myself? Let me tell you, I'm even afraid of myself when I get angry." "You're really made of clay." Tong Jingye nodded seriously. Chapter 343. When they went up the mountain they brought a bunch of glass bottles. When they went down the mountain they brought a bunch of metal sheets and wooden boxes. Rinpoche held a Type 85 rifle that was even longer than his body and pointed it at it from time to time. "Teacher, what is this?" Shurgan came over and asked. Everyone had been pondering over the thing in Rinpoche's hand for a long time. No matter how they looked at it, it looked like the gun that he used in the classroom. But how big was that one? How big was this? If this was used on a person, the consequences would make everyone shudder. "Do you want to know?" Rinpoche smiled kindly. "Yes." Shurgan nodded his head honestly. "Stand there and let me shoot a few times." Rinpoche pointed to the side. "Teacher, I didn't make any mistakes these days." Shurgan looked wronged. "You can only know the power of this thing after experiencing it yourself." Rinpoche's face was full of kindness. When Shurgan saw his smile, he shrank his neck and ran to the back of the crowd. However, Rinpoche really wanted to test the power of this gun since he hadn't used it since he got it. At the foot of the mountain, Rinpoche asked someone to bring over a small metal box. After opening it, there was a rolled-up ammunition chain inside. He pressed the ammunition chain on the anti-aircraft machine gun, set up the tripod, and aimed in the direction of the forest. Everyone looked curiously at Rinpoche fiddling with that strange-looking tube. The guards were curious about what it was, and the students were curious about how powerful it was. Tut tut tut. Rinpoche grabbed the handles on both sides of the back end and pulled the trigger at a big tree in the forest. The muzzle immediately emitted a half-meter-long flame. The moment the sound was heard, the metal chain stretched out from the top of Rinpoche's head like an antenna. The flame and the loud sound startled everyone. They were even more dumbfounded when they saw the scenery in the forest. From the time Rinpoche held the trigger to the time he stopped, only 10 seconds had passed. A big tree in the forest that required 2 people to wrap their arms around first saw sawdust flying everywhere. Soon after, half of the tree was gone, and it fell to the side with a creaking sound. That was a big tree that required 2 people to wrap their arms around. Even an earth wheel aboriginal expert with a weapon would have to exert some effort to break it. But now it fell to the ground just like that. This power made everyone feel apprehensive. "Teacher, can I play with it?" Tong Lan ran to Rinpoche's side and spoke in a lovely voice with a smile on her face. If she had a tail, she could also wag it at this moment. "Dream on," Rinpoche said as he dug his ear. This thing was pretty useful, but the sound was too loud. The recoil was still bearable with the help of the tripod to reduce the recoil. Of course, he was confident of his strength even without the tripod. Of course, of the recoil. After all, the strength of his hands was close to 350 kilograms, and his physical strength was even greater. It was not impossible for him to bench press up to 450 kilograms, which was already the best on Earth. Unfortunately, this gun was not designed to be used by a single person. The trigger was on the handle at the end of the gun. If one did not use a tripod, they would have to place the gun on someone else's shoulder. Humph. Tong Lan wrinkled her nose in dissatisfaction. Tong of Tong of two of the two of two of two were two of. Otherwise, 60 rounds would be used up too quickly. Rinpoche only had a total of 20 ammunition chains. There were 2 small boxes in a big metal box, which were 2 ammunition chains. In addition to the other ammunition that he had not brought back, he would need a team of 4-corn cows to carry ammunition for him when he went to the front line. When Rinpoche hung the gun on the 4-corn cow's back, that group of students swept up all the bullet casings on the ground and took them back as souvenirs. Just like when Rinpoche was young, even a bullet casing could be regarded as a good thing. Following which it took them 1.5 days to return to the city. Rinpoche was somewhat surprised to see Shurqing coming to greet him. "Sir Rin, you have done a big thing this time," Shurqing said as he pulled Rinpoche's arm. The production of salt was too important to Dayo. Even Shurqing couldn't sit still. Knowing that Rinpoche had returned to the city, he hurried over to meet him. After dismissing the students, Rinpoche chatted with Shurqing for a while before returning to the palace with the guards. The empress wasn't around and the palace was without a master. Although there weren't many people who left with the empress, it gave off an even more desolate feeling. Rinpoche walked in the palace and felt a little bored. The empress wasn't here and this place didn't have any significance to him. The weather was obviously quite hot, but it made him feel a little bleak as if it was late autumn. Back at Pingle Park, Rinpoche turned on the radio station and asked, "Is Her Majesty there?" There was no response for a long time. It seemed that the empress wasn't near the radio station. According to the route, she might reach the vicinity of Liao City today, which was also the front line of this war. She might encounter the Great Xia army at any time. Although Rinpoche had absolute confidence in the empress's skills and had 1,200 winged cavalry warriors, he still had some lingering thoughts in his heart. After walking one round in the courtyard, Rinpoche found something that he had almost forgotten about in the room next door. TNT explosives. Originally he wanted to use it to blow up the mines, but unfortunately he didn't use it. Now that he was going to the front line, there was nothing more to say. In addition, there were still 2.5 bottles of sarin gas in the antidote. He carefully wrapped them up and might need to use them when the time came. Rinpoche turned to look at Lin Xiaola, who was dozing off in the corner, and asked, "You are going to leave again tomorrow. Aren't you going back to Qingxin Palace Hall to say goodbye to Librarian Lin?" Lin Xiaola yawned and continued to doze off, as if she hadn't heard what Rinpoche said. "This time you are going to the battlefield. There are spirit wheel experts everywhere, and earth wheel experts are inferior to dogs. With your skills it might not be safe for you to go," Rinpoche threatened. Lin Xiaola finally opened her eyes. Her confusion gradually became clear, and then she had a thoughtful look on her face. "Protecting you on the battlefield is much more difficult than protecting you here. You have to double the amount of candy." Lin Xiaola, who had been pondering for a long time, opened her mouth and Rinpoche was speechless. "You're finally smart about this. Other than muscles there's only food left in your brain, right?" Rinpoche couldn't be bothered with him and asked someone to prepare a medicinal bath for him. While bathing, he turned on the radio station and asked from time to time, "Is Her Majesty around?" After he was done bathing, he heard a woman's voice from the radio station. "Is Li Qianqiu around?" "Greetings, Your Majesty. I will inform the Protector General now," another man said. "Your Majesty, have you reached Liao City?" Rinpoche took the opportunity to ask. "About 50 kilometers away," the Empress said faintly. "I have completed my task. Sir Tong is working overtime to build the salt pans. I have already returned to Lan City and will look for Your Majesty tomorrow. A day apart feels like 3 years. Now that more than 10 years have passed, I can't wait to set off." Rinpoche's voice was full of smiles. Chapter 344. Early the next morning, Rinpoche left the city with his guards and headed straight north. In the past he had seen on TV that the generals had long weapons like broadswords and lances hanging on their horses, and each of them looked majestic. At this moment, Rinpoche was standing beside the 4-corn cow with a retracted Type 85 anti-aircraft machine gun. He felt that he was more awe-inspiring than them. Even though 2 days had passed, the guards beside him would still occasionally look at the 2-meter-long anti-aircraft machine gun. The test fire that day had left a deep impression on everyone. It took the Empress 13 days to travel from Lan City to Liao City. Rinpoche estimated that they would arrive in 9 days, and this was after he had to return to Earth for 2 days. At that time he would be able to display the strength of the Tech Party and show them what it meant to be unparalleled. At the thought of this, Rinpoche's heart was on fire. He felt that his great spear was thirsty and couldn't wait any longer. Not long after Rinpoche and the rest set off, the Empress encountered the mounted scouts from Great Xia. When they were still a few hundred meters away, the other party encountered the winged cavalry's mounted scouts and turned around to run back. The goat riders were simply too easy to recognize. The winged cavalry was the only organized army that used giant goats as mounts. Furthermore, the winged cavalry was the focus of the Great Xia people, and they could be recognized just by looking at the equipment and mounts of the mounted scouts. A few winged cavalry scouts watched as the other party left, leaving behind a trail of dust. They turned their horses around and reported to the Empress. "Your Majesty, we have just encountered the scouts from Great Xia. I'm afraid they will know very soon." "How far is it from Liao City?" the Empress asked faintly. 50 li to go. "Get ready to face the enemy," the Empress said faintly as she reclined on the thick hide of the golden throne. She supported her head with one hand and held a wine glass with the other. "Turn on the radio," the Empress said again. Hong Yuan immediately turned on the radio. "Li Qianxiu, where are you?" the Empress asked. After a while, Li Qianxiu regained his composure. "Your Majesty, we have arrived at Pingjin Mountain." Pingjin Mountain was about 15 kilometers west of Liao City, and its speed was similar to that of the Empress's. This was also the reason why both parties had always been in contact. In a while, the winged cavalry will charge straight for the main camp of the Great Xia army after breaking through the intercepting enemy troops. At that time, the Great Xia army will definitely be in chaos. After breaking through the interception, you will seize the opportunity to launch a surprise attack. When the Empress said this, her face was slightly flushed and her eyes were as bright as the stars. It was unknown how much she was drunk or how much she was excited about the upcoming battle. As for whether the winged cavalry could break through the blockade, she had never considered this question. It would be a joke if 1,200 Earthwheel level knights couldn't break through the interception of the Great Xia army. At the east gate of Liao City, 25,000 soldiers of the Great Xia surrounded this place and took turns to attack. Towering ladders were being lifted up and placed on top of the city wall. War cries could be heard from every inch of the city wall. From time to time, people would scream miserably as they fell from the city wall. There were even more people lying silently on top of the city wall. A middle-aged general in iron armor stood in front of the tent, looking at the distant city wall, his brows tightly furrowed. This Liao City was simply too tough. 1,000 defenders, 2,000 soldiers who had retreated from Shun City, and the common people of the city had blocked the 70,000-strong army for a full 10 days. Countless corpses were left behind. At this time, a few mounted scouts quickly ran back to the camp. "Sir, we found traces of the winged cavalry 25 kilometers away." The middle-aged general, who was stroking his beard with his right hand, paused for a moment. Then he asked in a deep voice, "Do you have detailed information on the enemy?" "I encountered the enemy's mounted scouts before I could get close and returned to report to the general. However, from the dust I saw in the distance, there are only about 1,000 of them, not more than 2,000. They will be able to get close in about 4 hours. Quickly go and continue to investigate." Then, the middle-aged general raised his voice and said, "Someone, go to the main camp and inform the great general." An hour later, 15,000 of the 25,000 soldiers outside the east gate of Liao City headed in the direction of the Empress. At the same time, another 10,000 soldiers rushed over from the north of Liao City. Although there were only slightly more than 1,000 of them, Great Xia didn't dare to take them lightly. The strength of these 1,000 winged cavalry warriors was already equivalent to that of an army of tens of thousands. Furthermore, they were more mobile. Earlier, another 10,000 soldiers from the northern barracks of Liao City were dispatched to the west gate of Liao City and joined with the 30,000 soldiers outside the west gate. They surrounded the west gate and were also on guard against the 5,000 aboriginal soldiers near Mount Pingjin. The generals of Great Xia had been dealing with Dayo for more than 10 years. Naturally, they knew how powerful the aboriginal soldiers, whose weakest was at the manwheel level, were. They also knew how powerful the 1,000 winged cavalry warriors were. At this moment, the winged cavalry and the Great Xia soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center, who had defeated the Great Xia soldiers from Gyuk City, arrived in the vicinity of Liao City. This made the Great Xia soldiers somewhat afraid to act blindly without thinking. They even felt that their military strength was somewhat stretched. Even the siege from 3 directions gradually stopped, allowing the defenders and commoners in Liao City to temporarily heave a sigh of relief. At this moment, only half of the 3,000 soldiers in Liao City were left. If it weren't for the commoners who went up to the city wall to pick up the weapons of the fallen soldiers to kill the enemy, they probably wouldn't have been able to hold on. One had to know that they had persevered for nearly 7 days under the fierce attack of the 70,000 soldiers. Then they had persevered for 2 days under the joint attack of the 40,000 great Xia soldiers who had retreated from Gyuk City. At this point in time the city wall was in ruins. When one stepped on it there would be blood everywhere. The smell of blood had already numbed everyone on the city wall. When the great Xia soldiers retreated, it was unknown how many people were directly sitting in the blood. Most of them were ordinary commoners who Rinpoche felt were very simple. However, when they picked up their weapons they caused the great Xia soldiers to bleed profusely. Over the past few days at least 20,000 corpses were left at the bottom of the city wall. The losses in Liao City were equally disastrous. When the Empress and the winged cavalry arrived about 5 kilometers southeast of Liao City, they saw the great Xia soldiers blocking their way. At a rough glance there were at least 20,000 of them. Their halberds and spears were as dense as a forest, and many of their armors were stained with blood. An austere and somber aura swept over them. The ground in front of the battle formation was covered with rusty caltrops. Each caltrop had 4 spikes sticking out and a hole in the middle. 5 to 6 of them were strung together with ropes so that they could be retrieved after the battle. Crush them. The Empress stood on the golden throne and looked at the battle formation in the distance. Her body was overflowing with murderous intent. Dismount. Following the command, more than 1,000 winged cavalry warriors uniformly dismounted from their horses. Ha! Everyone let out a loud shout. The combined roars of more than 1,000 people were like an explosion, immediately causing a slight commotion in the front line of the great Xia army in the distance. Kill, a man ordered. Kill. More than 1,000 winged cavalry warriors quickly approached the front line in 3 rows. Their hands were holding onto the hilts of their swords, and their bodies were emitting an ice-cold murderous aura. Even when facing an enemy that was 20 times their number, they didn't show any signs of retreating. This was the most elite winged cavalry of the Aboriginals. Shoot! A command was issued from the great Xia army. With a buzzing sound, countless white feathers transformed into black shadows that blotted out the sky and the sun before crashing down again. It was like a rainstorm. At this moment, countless figures soared into the sky to meet the arrows. The long swords in their hands turned into rays of cold white light that shot down the rain of arrows. Shoot! Another wave of arrows was shot from the great Xia battle formation. Another few hundred figures soared into the sky. Kill. The eyes of many winged cavalry warriors were scarlet as they stared at the battle formation in front of them. They leaped up, crossed over 10 meters and went straight for the sea of spears in front of them. Like a tiger entering a flock of sheep, it set off a sea of blood. Looking from above, it looked like dozens of scalding steel knives had cut into a huge piece of cream. First it was cut open and then it melted on both sides. The battle formation of Great Xia immediately became fragmented. The Empress stood on the throne and drank a cup of wine. Then she threw the wine cup to the ground and broke it into countless pieces. Following which, a red shadow crossed a distance of hundreds of meters in a few flashes, stepped on countless heads of the Great Xia soldiers, and pounced toward the rear of the battle formation. Her clothes were as red as blood. P.S. Recommend a book, suddenly transmigrated. Ever since I was young I always had a bad habit. It was that whenever I had a nightmare I would teleport. Therefore when I was very young I traveled to all the countries in the world. However, there was a bug in this habit of mine. I couldn't control the destination I wanted to go to. Just like just now I was having a good sleep at home. In the end I had a nightmare and instantly transmigrated to a warm and fragrant bed. Where was this? Chapter 345. The screams before death, the cries of despair, the sound of a blade piercing into a human body, and the sound of a human body being thrown to the ground. Countless sounds entered the Empress's ears, but she didn't seem to hear them. At this moment she was sitting on a fine horse. Her hair was untied at some point in time, and her fine black hair cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Corpses were all around the fine horse. One of the corpses was a middle-aged general with glaring eyes. He was the commander of the 25,000 soldiers. However, his identity didn't help at all at this moment. Instead, it became the reason for his death. The great Xia commander was dead, and the soldiers began to flee in disorder. However, their running speed was far slower than the winged cavalry's pursuit. When they realized that no one could escape death in front of them and that no one would care about them if they fled to the sides, they quickly fled to the sides. The battlefield was in chaos. The Aboriginals ruthlessly bit off a huge chunk of the 25,000 soldiers' battle formation while the rest fled to the sides. Your Majesty, Countless blood-covered soldiers stopped in front of the Empress and regrouped. "Advance," the Empress said coldly as she turned her head and looked into the distance. The winged cavalry pounced on the 10,000 soldiers outside the east gate of Liao City like a wave. They had just received the news and organized their troops when they were attacked by the winged cavalry. Listen, what's that sound? On top of the city wall, the soldiers and commoners of Liao City, who were covered in blood and didn't even bother to clean up the minced meat on their faces, opened their eyes one by one and asked. "It's the reinforcements," someone shouted. "Reinforcements? The reinforcements are here." Upon hearing this news, everyone immediately became spirited. One by one they climbed up from the ground and held onto the city wall to look outside. Too few. Someone was disappointed when he saw the number of reinforcements in the distance. A little over 1,000 soldiers was indeed too few. One had to know that there were close to 100,000 Great Xia soldiers surrounding Liao City. Even if these 1,000 soldiers charged into the city, it would be much more effective than fighting outside. However, just as this thought flashed through his mind, someone shouted excitedly, "It's the winged cavalry! The winged cavalry is here!" Although there were only 1,000 winged cavalry warriors, their strength was comparable to that of an aboriginal army of 10,000 soldiers. This wasn't the only important thing. There was also the significance of the winged cavalry. The winged cavalry was here. Was Her Majesty coming? The people on the city wall looked around and quickly saw a person in red riding slowly from behind. Is that His Majesty? Many people only saw the red dot in the distance, but they couldn't see who it was. They could only guess that it was His Majesty. After all, the winged cavalry had already killed their way into the 10,000-strong army, and a red figure was slowly following behind them. Other than the Empress, no one else would have thought of it. Her Majesty is here with the winged cavalry. Such cheers gradually spread from the east gate to the center of the city, the north and the west. The whole city fell into a state of ecstasy. A general wearing leather armor quickly rushed to the east city wall and looked in that direction with a pair of binoculars in his hand. His face fell into an ecstatic expression. It's really His Majesty. At this moment he had an urge to take those who could still move and charge out immediately. I have fought alongside His Majesty in the future. However, when he glanced around and saw the deep exhaustion beneath the ecstasy on everyone's faces, he suppressed this thought to the bottom of his heart. When the Empress and the winged cavalry swallowed more than half of the 10,000-strong army, only a few thousand escaped. The Empress turned to look at the blood-stained city wall and continued to say coldly, "Advance." When the Empress and the winged cavalry arrived at the north of Liao City, they just happened to see the Great Xia army slowly retreating. There was a speed bump that was more than 100 meters long between the two sides that was filled with caltrops. More than 1,000 winged cavalry warriors and 5,000 aboriginal soldiers were fighting fiercely with the Great Xia army in the west of Liao City. This caused Great Xia, which had already lost more than 20,000 soldiers and 30,000 soldiers, to voluntarily retreat. That night, the Empress and the winged cavalry met up with Li Qianqiu's army in Liao City. The winged cavalry only lost a few dozen soldiers, and Li Qianqiu's 5,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center were only left with 4,000. Great Xia only withdrew 40,000 soldiers, and the number of injured soldiers they later regrouped was close to 70,000. 30,000 Great Xia soldiers died in battle. On the same day, the Great Xia army from Yuxing City continued to advance into the depths of Deiyou. 2 days later, 200,000 Great Xia reinforcements crossed Ziyue City and approached Liao City. At the same time as the Great Xia reinforcements, 5,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the South set off in the direction of Lan City. They were prepared to intercept the 80,000 Great Xia soldiers who were advancing into the interior of Deiyou from Yuxing City. At this point in time, Great Xia had already invested 700,000 soldiers. Of the 500,000 soldiers that were deployed for the first time, 200,000 were sent to besiege Chiesua Pass and Shun City, and the remaining 300,000 soldiers were sent to the 80,000 soldiers from Yuxing City and 70,000 soldiers outside Liao City. There was a total of 150,000 soldiers, as well as an unknown number of Great Xia practitioners from the sections. According to the estimates of the Protectorate of the North, there should be about 10,000 soldiers. Among them, the weakest were at the man-wheel level and there were many earth-wheel experts. Even though they couldn't compare to the aboriginal warriors of the same level in terms of strength, the combat power of both sides was greatly reduced. Unless they encountered an elite unit like the winged cavalry, they would be able to cause considerable damage to the majority of the aboriginal army. This was especially so when they were mixed in with the ordinary Great Xia soldiers and suddenly appeared in small teams during the battle. They were especially threatening. The war had only started for half a month, and 150,000 soldiers had already been lost. The war in this world was more brutal and bloody than what Rinpoche knew. After all, the lethality of those experts was too great, and the ordinary people on earth couldn't compare to them. An ordinary person might not be able to lift his arm after swinging his sword for 15 minutes, but a man-wheel expert could swing his sword for 2 hours. An earth-wheel expert wouldn't feel too tired even if he killed for half a day. On the side of the Aboriginals, only 22,000 of the 30,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the North were left, 4,000 of the 8,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the North were left, and the civilian casualties in Ziyue, Liao City, and Yuxing City were more than 10,000. Every day Rinpoche listened to the communications at the front line through the radio station and took notes of the current war-loss ratio. Excluding those killed by the winged cavalry, the current war-loss ratio between Dayo and Great Xia was 1:10. If the casualties of the Aboriginal civilians who had considerable combat power were included, it should be within 1:10 or even 1:5. Such a war-loss ratio was acceptable for Great Xia, but it was unacceptable for Dayo. One had to know that Great Xia still had 550,000 soldiers, and the Aboriginals could only mobilize the 22,000 soldiers from the Protectorate of the North, the remaining 4,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South, and the 5,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South. Even if the winged cavalry were to be used as an army of 10,000, it would only be slightly more than 40,000. Great Xia's confidence didn't only come from these 700,000 soldiers, but also from the 500,000 new soldiers that were being prepared. As for Dayo, they had 20,000 new soldiers and another 20,000 new soldiers that were being recruited. If the war-loss ratio was 1:10, the gap between the two sides' military strength would get bigger and bigger. This was also the first time that Rinpoche realized that there was actually such a situation where the enemy's casualties were 1/10 of the enemy's, but their losses were actually more severe than the enemy's. Chapter 346. Rinpoche's doubts were quickly answered by his own conjecture and the reply from the front line. The Great Xia army received a batch of rations from Yuxia City, which was enough to last them for half a month. After that, they left Great Xia's supply line. As a result, their marching speed wasn't considered fast. However, they didn't care because the army of the Protectorate of the North had no time to pursue them. They only needed to attack the other cities within half a month. To put it simply, they were an isolated army. They relied on the fact that the Great Xia army was holding up the other armies in the north of Dayo. Their rations were completely their own. If they were blocked outside a city and couldn't advance, they could only rely on Great Xia's supply line to deliver rations to them at great risk. Otherwise, they would collapse when their rations ran out. However, they dared to let such an isolated army penetrate deep into the north of Dayo because they had something to rely on. All the troops that Dayo could mobilize were pinned down. In the interior of Dayo, there were only 200 to 1,000 guards in each town, which was completely unable to resist this well-armed army. Needless to say, there were a large number of practitioners in this army. Therefore, before the reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South arrived, Dayo was temporarily helpless against this isolated army in the interior. What they had to do was very simple: destroy. In addition to individual strength, Dayo's foundation in agriculture was already very weak. If they allowed them to destroy and a large number of refugees left the original cities, Dayo would collapse as long as the war dragged on. One had to know that there were a total of more than 10 million Aboriginals. Most of them were in the 60,000 mountains, and there were about 3 to 4 million Aboriginals on the plains. At present, Dayo could barely sustain them. If the farmlands and livestock were destroyed, a large number of refugees would emerge. Under such circumstances, the imperial court of Dayo would have to empty the treasury to ensure that these refugees didn't starve to death. Previously, Dayo couldn't even recruit 20,000 new soldiers with rations. After the war, they decided to recruit 20,000 new soldiers. From this, one could see how empty Dayo's treasury was. As for whether these refugees lived or died, don't forget that the refugees in Dayo weren't like those from ordinary countries who didn't have much fighting power. Dayo's civilians had considerable fighting power. At that time, Dayo would be the first to fall into chaos. Great Xia was also aware of this point. It would be best if they could advance in multiple directions. If they were stopped, they would definitely encounter a large number of Aboriginal soldiers. There were only so many Aboriginal soldiers. With a large number pinned down, the remaining Great Xia soldiers could move freely within Dayo's borders. Other than a small number of news from the front line, Rinpoche guessed. He didn't know whether his guess was accurate or not, but he knew that if he were in Dayo's shoes, he would do the same. Furthermore, doing so would cause considerable harm to Dayo. One had to know that the land in the north of Lan City was occupied by more than half of the aboriginals. At this moment, it was completely exposed to the other party's blade. If the production resources of this land were destroyed, the Dayo would have been lost. However, Dayo would have Dayo. Great Xia believed that with the stalemate of the war, the destroyed areas of Dayo would be unable to restore production, and the fragile ecological balance within Dayo would be broken. The more food was scarce, the more difficult it would be for Dayo's internal situation. The more prominent problems there would be, the weaker Dayo would become. Just like a healthy person, if their immune system was destroyed, they would suffer from various diseases and eventually die. In Rinpoche's opinion, high-yielding crops like sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and potatoes would mature. Even though they couldn't be used as food for the army, they could still ensure that the refugees wouldn't starve to death. As Dayo's combat potential was unearthed, Dayo would become stronger and stronger. Don't forget that Dayo recruited 20,000 soldiers. According to the ratio, Great Xia had to recruit 200,000 soldiers. The aboriginals could be considered soldiers. Over 10 million aboriginals could recruit millions of soldiers. Could Great Xia do the same? Even though Great Xia's population was 10 times that of Dayo's, their training was much slower than Dayo's. Dayo only needed half a year, but Great Xia needed at least 2 years. When these elite soldiers were exhausted, would Great Xia send farmers to fight? Of course, there was a key problem. Sweet potatoes, pumpkins, and other high-yielding crops could fill their stomachs and stabilize Dayo. There were a few new crops that Great Xia didn't know about. Furthermore, Dayo's biggest trump card was Rinpoche. As long as there was enough ammunition and someone to stop the other party's experts, Rinpoche felt that he could defeat 10,000 soldiers alone. Rinpoche looked back at the ammunition boxes on the backs of a few forkhorn cows and continued to write and draw in his notebook. What he wrote was his analysis and conjecture of the current war. Rinpoche felt that, based on the current situation and his conjecture, if the war continued, Great Xia might cause considerable damage to Dayo, but it would be difficult for them to completely defeat Dayo. Unless Great Xia still had other trump cards that they hadn't used. As for whether his conjecture was correct or not, it would be clear just by looking at the movements of the Great Xia army in Yuxing City. If the other party was really as he had imagined, then what they would do next was to disperse and sweep the wilderness. Then they would combine to attack the city and repeat the cycle. "What are you writing?" Lin Xiaola asked while swaying on the back of the fork-horned cow. She had been swaying and dozing off for 3 days, but she didn't fall. As for the reason, it was because she was completely tied to the back of the fork-horned cow by the ropes. Rinpoche didn't know how useful such a tightly tied expert would be during an attack. He assumed that she didn't need to slowly untie the ropes. Otherwise, by the time she untied the ropes, his bones would have already turned into ashes. "Some conjectures," Rinpoche said as he closed his notebook. "Oh." After hearing what he said, Lin Xiaola couldn't be bothered to ask further. "There are no more candies." Lin Xiaola said expectantly. "Don't look for me when you have a toothache." Rinpoche took out a pack of White Rabbit creamy candies from the backpack on the fork-horned cow and threw it to Lin Xiaola. She immediately beamed with joy and squinted her eyes. The news spread very quickly. On the second day, there was news from the front lines that the Great Xia army that was attacking Yuxing City had split up and were advancing in different directions. After hearing this news, Rinpoche immediately knew that the other party was probably as he had guessed. Thus, he explained his conjecture of Great Xia's attack strategy through the radio. "Sir Ren, what do you think is the possibility of this?" Hong Wu's weak voice came from the radio. "After eliminating all the impossible reasons, there is only one truth." Rinpoche adjusted his sunglasses. "War isn't just about killing the enemy's strength. Destroying the enemy's economy and production is also an effective method. Furthermore, Great Xia doesn't only have these 80,000 soldiers. Don't forget that Great Xia still has 200,000 soldiers. It is entirely possible that a portion of them will converge with the Great Xia army outside Liao City while the other portion will continue to advance." Cough cough. "Protector General Li, what do you think?" Hong Wu asked. "I think it's possible," Li Qianqiu said after remaining silent for a while. "I also think it's possible," Hong Wu said softly. In Liao City, the Empress listened to the contents of the radio. She gently tapped the armrest of her chair with her fingers and asked faintly, "What do you think?" Hongwu and Li Qianqiu frowned and thought hard. "I have an idea," Ren Baqin immediately said. "Speak." The Empress nodded even though Ren Baqin couldn't see her movements. In addition to the few cities that are currently embroiled in the flames of war, there are 16 other cities north of Lan City that are defended by 4,600 soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center. What if he mobilized these 4,600 soldiers? Given the current situation in each city, it will be very difficult for them to resist the attack of the Great Xia army. They can only delay for some time. Since this is the case, why don't we transfer these soldiers to one place? Instead, it will cause more trouble for them. Otherwise, even if 5,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South arrive, it will be very difficult to stop over 80,000 Great Xia soldiers and those practitioners from the martial arts world. In that case, the area north of Lan City will be completely defenseless. The other party doesn't need to unite their troops and just needs to attack separately. Hongwu shook his head slightly and felt that Ren Baqian's idea was too simple. We can set up a militia regiment. In the past, the military was affected by ordnance and rations. Now the problem of ordnance has been solved. As for rations, during wartime, every aboriginal should contribute to defend their homeland. Furthermore, they can also receive a steel saber as a weapon. I believe that many people will be interested in it. At that time, the meritorious deeds during the war will be recorded and the rewards will be distributed after the war. Tell me in detail. The Empress's interest was piqued. The term militia regiment was refreshing to her. Chapter 347. The Aboriginal commoners aren't weak. As long as they reach adulthood and train a little, they can attain the strength of a Great Xia man-wheel expert and become a low-level officer in Great Xia. They don't lack courage. This can be seen from the fact that a large number of commoners in Yuxing City and Liao City resisted and defended their cities in times of crisis. What they lack is just weapons, training to coordinate with them, and someone to organize them. Although war is the business of soldiers, at this moment when the army can't protect them, they need to protect themselves. Although there will be casualties, it's still better than the current situation. As long as a small number of elite soldiers are used as the backbone and the commoners are used as flesh and blood. For example, a team of 10 people, 1 elite soldier and 9 commoners, can form a fairly strong army in a short period of time. Furthermore, if we need to replenish the army, they can form a fighting force faster than recruits from the mountains. This is feasible, Hongwu said after a long silence. Although he didn't like to push commoners onto the battlefield, he had to think of a way to reverse the situation. Otherwise, if he allowed that army to wreak havoc in the hinterland of Dayo, even if they were driven away, it would take a long time for them to recover. Not to mention the 200,000 reinforcements from Great Xia. As long as 100,000 reinforcements joined with the 70,000 soldiers outside Liao City, they would be able to stall the winged cavalry and the soldiers from the Protectorate of the Center in Liao City. If the 100,000 reinforcements also entered the hinterland of Dayo, there would be more than 180,000 reinforcements. Even if the 5,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South arrived, it was very likely that they would be swallowed by them. If that happened, the situation would be even more difficult. As long as this system is implemented, they can focus on their own lives in the future and gather together during the war. This way, we don't need to consume too much rations and can mobilize an army of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands within a short period of time. Great Elder, call Qin Chuan over to discuss this issue together, the Empress ordered. There is another problem, which is the 2 armies that entered Dayo. Since they are replenishing their rations on the spot, we can completely fortify the walls and clear the fields. We can inform all the people in the strongholds to take away all the edible food and gather them in the cities, leaving them with nothing in the wilderness. If the cities are breached, evacuate the people in the cities and destroy all the rations that can't be brought away. If they wanted to replenish their rations on the spot, then they would be left empty-handed. They could only retreat or rely on Great Xia to replenish their rations. If it's the former, we can cut off their path of retreat and swallow them whole. If it's the latter, we can cut off their rations, force them to retreat and then block their way back, Ren Baqin continued. We don't have enough soldiers. Li Qianqiu's words made it clear that they were powerless at the moment. In the face of the aggressive Great Xia, Dayo fell into a passive position in a short period of time. If the 16 towns to the north of Lan City were to be implemented according to the method just now, we would be able to deploy at least 3,000 soldiers. Although more than half of the soldiers to the south of Lan City have been deployed, we should still be able to assemble 1,500 soldiers, right? Together with the 5,000 reinforcements from the Protectorate of the South, they would be able to make up a total of 9,500 soldiers. Furthermore, even though the Empress's winged cavalry seemed to be delayed in Liao City, they could be dispatched at any time. At that time they would be able to take down one of the two armies. We have a radio station so we can communicate with each other at any time, but they can't. At the mention of the radio station, everyone felt a little more relaxed. This was currently their greatest advantage over Great Xia. Furthermore, why don't we change our method of battle? We have fewer people than them, and our 8,000 soldiers have the combat power of their 80,000 soldiers. In terms of flexibility, we are also much better than them. Furthermore, many of them were born in the mountains and are good at archery. We can circle around them and harass them with bows and arrows at all times. After a wave of attacks, we will retreat. Unless the enemy is cavalry, they won't be able to catch up to us. We can directly annihilate a small number of cavalry soldiers, Rinpoche continued. Even though our soldiers have stronger arm strength than the Great Xia soldiers, in terms of archery, we are inferior to Dayo. As a result, the shooting range of both sides is very close. When our soldiers are able to use bows and arrows to attack the enemy, they are also exposed to the enemy's arrows at the same time. In every battle, our losses are the greatest during this period. On the contrary, when both sides engage in close combat with real swords and spears, the losses will be much smaller, Hongwu answered Rinpoche's question. It's not that we don't have a solution. We just need to move quickly. The Great Xia army is bloated and they are much less flexible than us. Rinpoche pondered for a while and thought about the army of Genghis Khan. Even though the aboriginals relied on their two legs, their running speed wasn't very fast. But when we reached the vicinity of the Great Xia army, they have already discovered us. Hongwu insisted on his own opinion on this matter. Rinpoche didn't refute him anymore. In this aspect, Hongwu knew more than him. It was better for him to stay at the front line for a period of time before deciding. Following which, everyone discussed the issue of strengthening the militia and clearing the fields for a long time. Rinpoche really wanted to name the militia the City Management Brigade. Just this name alone would provide a 30% increase in combat power. Unfortunately, the Empress's veto power directly rejected this idea. Although strengthening the defenses and clearing the fields was currently the right method, the people of Dayo felt a little heartache at the thought of destroying crops that hadn't even matured yet. After this battle, everyone in Dayo would probably have to tighten their bellies. Don't worry about the food. It will be fine as long as the sweet potatoes are ripe. Furthermore, Great Xia doesn't lack food, Rinpoche comforted everyone. As long as the current Great Xia army was crippled, the situation between the two sides would be reversed. Great Xia's land would be free to be used as they pleased. After the agreement was made over the radio, the Ministry of War immediately started to work on the militia. Large quantities of weapons that were originally intended to be used to equip the new recruits were transferred to the various towns in the north of Lan City. Shi Qing also ordered the various towns to gather the commoners in the nearby strongholds. Those that could be brought along would be brought along and those that couldn't be brought along would be destroyed. The entire north of Dayo was in motion. On the other hand, Rinpoche continued his journey northeast. After traveling for a day, he rested for the night in a stronghold. Sir, how's the situation now? Early in the morning, the chief looked at Rinpoche and the rest who were preparing to eat and asked. The commoners didn't understand the current situation of the war, but they had heard that a city in the north had already been destroyed by the Great Xia army. The order will be issued soon. All the strongholds will gather the food and enter the nearest town. Those that can be brought along will be brought along and those that can't be brought along will be destroyed. Even if the chief didn't ask, he still had to say it. This place was already too close to the front line. How can we do that? The chief was shocked. At present, the vegetables in the fields would be ripe in another half a month. At that time, a portion would be used for their own use and a portion would be sold in the city in exchange for meat. This would be enough to cover nearly half of their rations. As for the other half, it would be the water buffaloes and other livestock that were raised in the stronghold. If they were to lose half of their rations, they would probably have a hard time in the future. The Great Xia army will be here soon. These rations will not be destroyed because they are prepared for them. Withdraw to the city and the imperial court will make arrangements for them, Rinpoche said faintly. At this moment, they suddenly heard a clamor coming from the entrance of the stronghold. Sir, it's the Great Xia army. Whose face darkened after listening attentively. Ren Baqin tilted his head. You guys run faster than Chow Chow. Chapter 348. Bring me my big gun. Ren Baqin gestured to the side. Immediately someone brought the 2.15-meter anti-aircraft machine gun over and Ren Baqin grabbed it. Bring the ammo box too. Ren Baqin called out again. Then he stepped forward and walked toward the entrance of the village. Who hurriedly followed behind him. Wake up the one who's still sleeping, Ren Baqin said without turning his head. At critical moments Lin Xiaola was still more reliable. It was not that Hu and the others were unreliable, but their strength was slightly too low. In any case, Lin Xiaola was the bodyguard that the Empress found for Ren Baqin. The Empress should have a good understanding of her strength. When they arrived at the entrance of the stronghold, the main gate of the stronghold was being pulled shut. It was a little chaotic here. Some people were blocking the gate while others were looking for weapons. It was a mess. Who are you? How many are there? Who caught a person and asked. It's the Great Xia army. There are at least a few thousand of them, the person who was caught said anxiously. Ren Baqin went up to the corner tower of the stronghold and looked out. He saw a long line of soldiers advancing toward the stronghold from afar. The front line was at least a few kilometers away from the stronghold, and a lot of dust was kicked up behind them like a yellow dragon. Can you tell how many there are? Ren Baqin asked Who. Following which, he said to the people behind him, Bring me all the ammunition boxes and my bag. Then he opened the 2 boxes and connected the ammunition chains together. Judging from the amount of dust they kicked up, there are at least 3,000 to 4,000 people, Who said after a long time of silent calculation. Ren Baqin nodded and waited there. There were more than 300 old and weak people in the stockade village, and close to 200 young and strong people. In fact, aboriginals in their 50s could be considered young and strong. At the very least, their combat power wasn't bad. Furthermore, these people were barely able to defend against 1,000 Great Xia soldiers, let alone a few thousand enemy soldiers. After all, even though these people weren't weak, they were only a bunch of slightly stronger villagers compared to the elite Great Xia soldiers who lacked swords and sabers. Even if they had the strength of a man-will expert, they were just a bunch of slightly stronger villagers. My lord, should we retreat? Even if we bring the people from the stronghold with us, as long as they don't have any cavalry, they won't be able to catch up to us, Who said in a low voice. Retreat? Great luck, and we'll be eating chicken later. Ren Baqin glanced at him. Today my great spear is finally going to be used and you're telling me to retreat? After thinking for a while, Ren Baqin said, Let the old and weak in the stronghold evacuate first. Don't bring anything with you. If we really can't hold on any longer, we'll retreat. While they were talking, Ren Baqin's backpack and 20 ammunition belts were sent to the corner tower. The other wooden boxes were also piled up below. Ren Baqin took out a pair of binoculars from his bag. Through the binoculars, he was able to see more clearly and could even see the faces of the people in front. 4 people in a row were advancing in this direction with spears in their hands. It was impossible to tell how long it was. However, Ren Baqin saw the shadows of horses. Fortunately, there weren't many of them. Let the old and the weak retreat. If they stay here, it will be troublesome if they really have to escape, Ren Baqin urged Who. Who glanced at the spear that Ren Baqin had set up. Even though he had seen the power of this thing that day, he wasn't sure if it could stop the Great Xia army. There were too many of them. If things didn't turn out well, they would let that girl take Sir Ren away first. No matter what, they would be able to hold them back for a while. At the thought of this, he went to make arrangements. Not long after, the old and the weak in the village, accompanied by dozens of strong young men, left the back of the village and headed straight for Shaojiang City, which was half a day's journey away. The front line of the Great Xia army arrived at a place 500 meters away from the village and stopped, waiting for the people behind them to arrive. Do you really want to stop them here? Lin Xiaola finally came to her senses at this moment. She leaned against the wall of the corner tower and spoke unhurriedly. I will fight to the death and not retreat. Ren Baqin grinned, revealing a set of ghastly white teeth. Lin Xiaola looked at him suspiciously. When did he become so strong-willed? How is it? Am I strong-willed? Ren Baqin laughed mischievously. Strong-willed. Just don't shout for help later. Lin Xiaola threw a piece of white rabbit creamy candy into her mouth and carefully counted the amount of white rabbit creamy candy in her sachet. Every time she ate a piece, she would count it again. It might have something to do with her math teacher's early death, and she was afraid that she would lose the sweets. Rinpoche turned his head and shouted, "Leave 2 people behind to help me reload the ammunition belts. The rest of you stay in your respective positions. Each guard will be assigned to 3 able-bodied young men." At this moment, there were 3 assembled ammunition belts on the ground. Each belt consisted of 5 ordinary ammunition belts connected together and contained 300 bullets. At the same time, there were also 300 bullets loaded into the gun. The Great Xia army outside didn't wait for everyone to arrive. When the first 1,000 soldiers arrived, they formed a battle formation and pressed toward the village. Even though the footsteps of 1,000 soldiers weren't uniform, Rinpoche, who was on the corner tower, felt the ground tremble slightly. "Let them come closer, closer so that they won't run away later." Rinpoche used his eyes to aim through the scope, aimed the muzzle at the front of the battle formation and muttered softly. To be honest, it would be a lie to say that he wasn't nervous at all. In front of him was a battle formation of 1,000 soldiers. Even though Rinpoche had a gun in his hand, he was still somewhat nervous. He wasn't the only one who was nervous. The others were nervous as well. Needless to say, the able-bodied young men were facing thousands of elite Great Xia soldiers even though they had tough temperaments. Under such circumstances, staying here was practically a dead end. It was already extremely courageous for them to stay here at this time. Among them, there was a reluctance to leave their homeland and the thought of stopping the old and weak from leaving first. They would leave when they really couldn't stop the Great Xia army anymore. This was what most of them were thinking. Their faces were tense as they stared at the Great Xia army in the distance and clenched the weapons in their hands. "Huzi, don't be lenient later," someone said to the young man beside him. "Watch me. I will smash their brains in a while," the young man said with a thick wooden stick in his hand. Not long after, he asked again, "Can we stop them?" "Why should we? There are thousands of them. We will try to delay them until they are far away and we can't stop them anymore. Then we will retreat," the strong man said. As for the other guards, they were already prepared to fight to the death and let Rinpoche escape. However, they still had some expectations in their hearts. They hoped that Rinpoche's weapon would really be able to stop the Great Xia army outside the village. They watched as the other party's long spears pointed diagonally forward and approached the village step by step. 4 to 5 arrows were shot into the Great Xia battle formation. Both sides hadn't communicated with each other since the beginning. Both the elite soldiers of Great Xia and the aboriginals in the village were silent. In the eyes of both sides, the other party wasn't only an enemy nation but also a foreign race. Only one side could survive. A few Great Xia soldiers were shot and immediately fell to the ground in silence. There was only a slight commotion in the battle formation before they stepped over the bodies of the few people on the ground. This kind of silence and the intensive footsteps made Rinpoche feel even more depressed. However, a smile appeared on his face. It was the same smile that he had when he was the Honglu deputy and asked Xiongpai to hang that guard from the Lian family. It was a very kind smile, but it concealed everything in his heart, making it impossible for others to know what he was thinking. Bang bang bang. Rinpoche pressed the trigger and the muzzle immediately spat out a half-meter-long flame. At this moment, the Great Xia battle formation was finally no longer silent. The moment the flame was spat out, it set off a wave of blood. Broken limbs flew everywhere and many people fell to the ground without making a sound. However, there were still many people who had broken arms or legs and were screaming on the ground. A 12.7 bullet could almost break a person's waist when it hit the body. If it hit other parts of the body, broken limbs would fly everywhere. Furthermore, from Rinpoche's angle, if the first shot hit the chest of the person in front, the bullet would make a big hole in his chest and even break the legs of the person behind him. From the scope, he could clearly see that the flesh and blood of the Great Xia soldiers were splattered everywhere. Like wheat being reaped, they fell in rows with miserable screams. Fragments of internal organs spurted out from the wounds and scattered everywhere. Most people didn't know what had happened before they realized that a piece of their body was missing. Chapter 349. Bang 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 bang. A series of machine gun sounds resounded above the stronghold. This was the first time that this kind of weapon, which was very unfamiliar to this world, had brought about a result that made people shudder. Click click. When the combination ammunition chain was emptied, Rinpoche threw it directly below the corner tower and said, "Reload." His hand didn't stop pressing the other combination ammunition chain onto the gun. He aimed at the great Xia soldiers who were at a loss after discovering that the people in front of them had fallen to the ground in pieces and pulled the trigger again. The captain of the great Xia army looked at the people at the front of the line who had fallen into a pool of blood. He listened to the miserable howls of the great Xia soldiers whose limbs were broken or who had a big hole in their abdomen. He originally thought that an aboriginal village would only cause a little trouble at most, even if it wasn't as easy as falling to a rock under the attack of 1,000 elite soldiers. That was what he was thinking a minute ago. He didn't expect that a corner tower in the stockade would suddenly spit out a tongue of flame, accompanied by a clear and strange sound. Then the soldiers in front of him fell down like straws. A quarter of the 200 elite soldiers were turned into a sea of blood and minced meat. This wave of attack was too sudden, and the method of attack was completely unfamiliar. Until now, he still didn't know what exactly the other party was using. Whether it was in terms of power or speed, it was much more powerful than an arrow. It was so powerful that it terrified him, and he couldn't help but reveal a panicked expression. If this went on, he was afraid that these 1,000 elite soldiers would all fall to the ground before they could even reach the walls of the stronghold. Although he shouted for a retreat, the great Xia soldiers were too densely packed. Ren Baqian's second ammunition chain was emptied, and another half of the soldiers fell to the ground. At this moment, half of the 1,000 great Xia soldiers had already fallen to the ground. Reload. Ren Baqian threw the ammunition chain below the corner tower without any expression on his face. At this moment, all his emotions had completely calmed down. His heart rate dropped from 160 to 70, and the bloody scene and the miserable howls outside the stronghold had been completely cast out of his mind. There was a saying that went, after watching all the action movies in the world, one would naturally have no code in his heart. Ren Baqian did the opposite. After seeing so much blood, he would naturally have a code in his heart. Ren Baqian felt that this was his realm. The loneliness of being an expert arose spontaneously. Who was the one who shouted for a retreat just now? Was it that person with a green feather on his hat? He was dressed like a military officer. As Ren Baqian thought about it, he aimed and pulled the trigger. The great Xia captain's body seemed to have been electrocuted. He magically twisted his body and actually dodged the bullet. Ren Baqian's eyes widened. Your waist is as thick as a water bucket, yet you can twist your waist like a water snake? As expected of an expert. Da-da-da. Several large holes immediately appeared on the bodies of the two soldiers beside the captain. Ren Baqian simply swept the muzzle of his gun horizontally and finally turned that great Xia officer into a pile of mosaic. Ren Baqian then turned the muzzle to the great Xia soldiers who were fleeing in all directions. It was a bit of a waste just now. 600 bullets killed or maimed 500 people. Given the density of the great Xia army, a considerable number of them killed or maimed 2 people at a time. Based on this calculation, the hit rate was at most 50%. What's more, this was when the enemy was so densely packed. This time Ren Baqian slowed down a lot. The almost non-stop gunshots were reduced to 2 or 3 short gunshots. Those guards watched as Great Xia's battle formation closed in. They watched as the strange weapon emitted a sound and the Great Xia battle formation was set off in a rain of blood. They watched as the Great Xia soldiers fell in rows and the Great Xia army, which originally had an imposing aura, scattered in confusion. Everyone was dumbfounded. They looked at the Great Xia army and then looked at the flaming tongues from the other corner tower. They looked as if they were looking at a god. All the nervousness and apprehension from before had completely disappeared. Ren Baqian stopped pulling the trigger. About 100 people ran away from the enemy with 4 ammunition belts. In the end, some of them even evolved to run in an S-shaped pattern, which made Ren Baqian exclaim in admiration. He had brought a total of 5,000 rounds of ammunition. This kind of bullet was too heavy. One bullet weighed 131 grams, which was a little more than 2.5 ounces. 4 of these bullets weighed about half a kilogram. Including the box, he could only bring more than 2,000 rounds at a time. After firing these 4 ammunition belts, there were less than 4,000 rounds left. It was better to use them sparingly. As such, he couldn't be bothered to shoot those who ran too far away. Even though the effective range of this gun was more than 1,000 meters, Ren Baqian was very confident in his marksmanship. It wasn't worth it to waste too many bullets on those few people. Outside the stronghold, there were corpses and flesh scattered all over the ground. The area closest to the stronghold was the most concentrated, and the further away it was, the more scattered it was. How lonely it is to be invincible. How empty it is to be invincible. Standing alone at the peak, the cold wind blows continuously. My loneliness. who can understand me? Rinpoche hummed a tune as he picked up the binoculars and looked at the Great Xia army that was 1 kilometer away. He saw a few people standing in front of the Great Xia army and looking in his direction. The 100 Great Xia soldiers who ran back to save their lives were telling them something. Following which, Rinpoche used the binoculars to look to the side. His eyes suddenly froze. What was that? That black cylinder that was being pulled by a carriage? A cannon! Rinpoche exclaimed. There was actually such a thing in the Great Xia army? Lin Xiaola, who had been staring at the anti-aircraft machine gun, finally regained her senses. What cannon? Rinpoche pointed in the direction of the Great Xia army. He opened his mouth and didn't say anything for a long time. The Great Xia army actually had cannons? This was too much of a surprise. He never thought that he would actually see such a thing in this world. However, as he continued to observe, he realized that the cannons of the Great Xia army should be very primitive, like the early iron cannons from the Yuan and Ming dynasties. They were very clumsy and didn't have much power. However, he would only know the specifics after obtaining them. Rinpoche frowned. He felt that it was necessary for him to bring his Italian cannon over. If Great Xia took out something else, he wouldn't feel anything. However, they actually took out cannons. Rinpoche felt that he was being provoked. Sir Rin, this is really too powerful. Shi Hu hurriedly ran to the corner tower and exclaimed. Although he already knew that this thing wasn't weak, he didn't expect it to be so terrifying. Especially in the face of a military formation. Rinpoche grunted twice. He had to maintain the demeanor of an expert. He then continued to use the binoculars to look at the other side. There were a few people who looked like generals standing in front of the army and pointing at them. Many of them were frowning, showing either fear or anger. One of them was particularly eye-catching. The silver helmet on his head was shining brightly. Rinpoche felt that he would be going against his conscience if he didn't shoot him. If he killed the other party's general, would the other party retreat? Even if he had to waste more bullets to kill the other party, it would be worth it. Needless to say, the other party's generals actually gathered together. At the thought of this, Rinpoche gently moved the muzzle to aim at the other party and then held the trigger. Through the scope, the general wearing the silver helmet revealed an astonished look. Soon after, a long saber appeared in his hand and he waved it in the air. A few sparks flashed in the air, and the long saber in the general's hand turned into a pile of fragments. Then the general tried to dodge. However, the bullets from the machine gun were too dense and fast. The killing range of this gun on flat ground was 1,500 meters. At 1,000 meters, it still had considerable lethality. In addition, it could fire 6 rounds per second. The general wanted to dodge, but he was turned into a mist of blood. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.